He handed his wife divorce papers on their 20th anniversary, in front of every crime boss, politician, and power broker in New York City. He called her invisible. He called her nothing. He smiled for the cameras while she bled in silence. By sunrise, he had no empire left to smile about. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, say, this story is for you. Watch until the end, because what Evelyn Cross does next will change the way you think about power forever. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The flowers had cost $4,000. Vincent Moretti knew the exact number because his assistant, a nervous 26-year-old named Carlo, who wore his ties too tight and kept a running spreadsheet of Vincent's spending, had whispered it into his ear that afternoon with the practiced reverence of a man delivering communion. $4,000 for white roses and birds of paradise, arranged into towers along the entrance of the Harrington Grand's ballroom, their stems wrapped in black satin ribbon at Vincent's specific instruction. He had told the florist he wanted the room to feel like power, like something you couldn't walk into without understanding, immediately and without question, that the man behind it owned the kind of life most people only imagined from the outside. He'd gotten what he paid for. 300 people moved through that ballroom in their finest clothes. Senators and their wives, 3 sitting judges, a deputy mayor whose name appeared on city contracts worth more than the GDP of small nations, captains from 4 of the 5 major families, 2 entertainment lawyers who handled money that had never been introduced to a tax return, and enough decorated ex-federal agents turned private security consultants to populate a small police precinct. They ate duck confit and aged prime rib. They drank a Barolo that Vincent had imported specifically for the occasion. They laughed at the right moments and lowered their voices at others, because everyone in that room understood the grammar of Vincent Moretti's world without needing it explained. He stood at the center of it in a charcoal suit that had been cut for him in Milan 3 weeks ago, a glass of champagne held loosely in one hand, his jaw set in the particular way that men with decades of authority hold their faces when they are deeply, quietly pleased with themselves. He was 53 years old and looked it in all the ways that read as distinction rather than age. The silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his mouth that came from decades of command rather than worry, the weight of his posture suggesting that gravity itself deferred to him slightly. Evelyn was across the room. She wore a deep midnight blue dress that probably cost more than most of his captains made in a month, and she looked exactly the way she always looked at these events. Composed, gracious, unhurried. She was speaking to the wife of Alderman Russo, her hand resting lightly on the woman's forearm, in that particular gesture she had, the one that made whoever she was talking to feel like the only person in the room. Evelyn Cross Moretti had always known how to make people feel seen. It was one of the qualities Vincent had cataloged about her in the early years, before he stopped cataloging her qualities at all. She was 47. She had been 19 when they met, 22 when they married, and somewhere in the 20 years between that wedding and this room, Vincent had stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a function. The wife, the hostess, the woman who made sure the flowers were arranged and the seating chart was correct and the right people received the right invitations. She handled the social mechanics of his world with a precision that he'd never once acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required him to pay attention. He hadn't paid attention in a very long time. Vanessa arrived at 7:43. He knew the exact time because he'd checked his watch when the room shifted. That subtle, collective change in air pressure that happens when someone extraordinarily beautiful walks into a space full of people who have trained themselves to notice everything. She was 34 years old, the daughter of a Connecticut real estate family, and she moved through a crowd the way certain women move when they have learned early that their appearance is a kind of currency that never fully depreciates. Her dress was red. Her hair was dark. Her smile when she found Vincent's eyes across the room was the kind of smile that is designed to look private in public. He smiled back. He should not have done it where Evelyn could see. But Evelyn had always been so quiet, so contained, so endlessly, infuriatingly patient. And Vincent, who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by men who watched his face for signals of approval or danger, had somewhere along the way decided that Evelyn's patience was the same thing as absence, that she didn't see what she didn't react to, that her silence was vacancy rather than choice. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about it for years. At 8:15, Vincent's longtime consigliere and financial advisor Damien Wolfe appeared at his elbow with the quiet materialization of a man who has made a career out of being exactly where Vincent needed him to be. Damien was 51, lean in the way of men who are always calculating, with a face that had never quite committed to an expression. He had handled Vincent's financial architecture for nearly 2 decades, the holding companies, the investment structures, the elaborate legal plumbing through which Moretti money flowed from its various sources into the legitimate economy. He was, as far as Vincent understood it, the most valuable man in his organization next to Vincent himself. "Everything is in place," Damien said quietly. Vincent nodded. He didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. The evening progressed exactly as these evenings always progressed. Toasts, conversation, careful negotiations conducted in the language of small talk, alliances reinforced through proximity, and shared meals and the ancient social contract of breaking bread in the same room. Vincent moved through it with the ease of long practice, pressing the right flesh, landing the right jokes, reading the room's temperature with the particular sixth sense that men who've survived in his world for decades develop or die without. At 9 o'clock, he called for silence. 300 people turned toward him. The room quieted with the practiced obedience of crowds that understand instinctively that the man at the front of the room controls more than just the evening. Vincent raised his glass. 20 years, he said, and his voice carried the warmth of a man who has spent time rehearsing the precise degree of warmth required. 20 years is a long time, long enough to build something, long enough to know what matters. He paused for exactly the right number of beats, and long enough to know when something has run its course. The room shifted. It was subtle, a slight drop in temperature, a collective micro-expression of confusion passing through 300 faces in the same half-second. But Vincent felt it and chose not to care. He looked at Evelyn. She was standing 12 feet away, near the edge of the head table, her champagne glass still raised from the toast she'd assumed was coming. Her eyes found his, and for a moment, just a moment, there was something in them that he could not read. Not panic, not anger, something more controlled than either of those things. Something that if he had been the kind of man who paid attention, he might have identified as recognition. He reached into the interior breast pocket of his suit jacket. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, sealed with nothing because it didn't need sealing. He crossed the space between them and held it out. Evelyn. The room had gone completely silent now. The kind of silence that isn't empty but loaded. Every person in it suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for a very long time. She looked at the envelope. She looked at his face. She didn't take it immediately. She made him hold it there for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for the silence to become something else, something sharper. And then she took it from his hand with the same unhurried composure she brought to everything, and opened it and read it in the same amount of time it might take to read a menu. He watched her face for the collapse, for the crack, for the moment when Evelyn Cross Moretti, who had been nothing but invisible for 20 years, finally broke open in front of the people who'd never seen her as anything but an accessory to his power. Her face did not change. "These are divorce papers," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was even. "I wanted everyone here," Vincent said, and now his voice had shifted into the register he used when he was making an example of something. That particular tone of public authority designed to land in every corner of the room simultaneously. "I wanted it done honestly, in front of people who know us both." He reached for Vanessa's hand without looking. She'd moved to his side at precisely the right moment, as if choreographed, and brought her forward. "Vanessa and I intend to be married." Someone in the room dropped a glass. No one moved to pick it up. Vanessa stood at his side with her hand in his and her chin at a slight upward angle, that red dress absorbing the ballroom light, her expression carrying the particular combination of triumph and studied innocence that people use when they want to appear reluctant about something they have wanted very badly for a long time. Vincent continued. He talked about growth and change and the necessity of honesty, and somewhere in the middle of it he said the words he'd arranged in his head over the preceding weeks. That Evelyn had been a wonderful hostess, that she'd managed his household and his social calendar with tremendous dedication, that she had contributed to his life in all the ways that quiet, domestic women contribute to the lives of men, building real things in the real world. He said it without cruelty, or without what he understood cruelty to be, which was loudness and viciousness and obvious disrespect. He did not understand that what he was doing was crueler than any of those things. He was diminishing 20 years of a person's life in front of 300 witnesses and calling it honesty. Evelyn let him finish. She stood completely still while he spoke, the divorce papers held at her side in one hand, her champagne glass in the other, her posture unchanged. She had very good posture. She always had. Vincent had stopped noticing years ago. When he finished, she set her champagne glass on the nearest table. She took her wedding ring from her left hand, the 3-carat cushion-cut diamond set in platinum that he'd placed on her finger at St. Patrick's Cathedral 20 years ago. And she set it on the table beside the glass with a small, precise sound. She looked at the papers in her other hand, then set those on the table too. She uncapped the pen that had appeared in her other hand, signed where required with the clean, unhurried signature of someone who has made a decision long before the moment it's executed, and placed the pen down beside the ring. Then she looked up, not at Vincent, at the room, at 300 people who were watching her in the particular way that crowds watch the moment before the explosion, when it's too late to move, but the mind hasn't caught up yet. "Thank you all for coming this evening," Evelyn said. "I hope the rest of your night is exactly what you deserve." She picked up her small evening bag from the table. She turned and walked toward the exit. The cameras the entertainment journalists had brought for what they'd expected to be an anniversary party erupted. The sound was like a flock of birds startled into flight, a mechanical, percussive burst of light, and shutter sound following Evelyn Cross Moretti across the length of the Harrington Grand's ballroom, capturing each frame of her exit in the kind of detail that would live on front pages by morning. She didn't look back. The doors closed behind her. The room stood in silence for what felt much longer than it was. Then Vincent said something light and dismissive, something that was supposed to dissolve the tension and return the evening to his control, and the crowd shifted back into performance. Glasses raised, conversation resumed, the elaborate social machinery re-engaging because 300 powerful people had not come to the Harrington Grand to let someone else's drama derail their evening. Vincent Moretti drank champagne and laughed with Vanessa and pressed flesh with his Don and his judges and his deputy mayor and told himself it had gone exactly as planned. He did not sleep well that night. He told himself it was the alcohol and the late hour. He did not think about Evelyn. He did not think about her the way a man doesn't think about a thing he's actively suppressing. He pushed her out of each time she surfaced, which was more often than he would have admitted to anyone, and filled the space with Vanessa's warmth and the particular narcotic satisfaction of having done the thing he'd decided to do in the way he'd decided to do it, publicly and without apology. He slept badly and woke at 5:47 to the sound of his phone. The number was unfamiliar. He answered it anyway because men in his position cannot afford to ignore unknown numbers at 5:47 in the morning. "Mr. Moretti?" A woman's voice. Professional, unhurried. The kind of voice that belongs to someone in a building with a very clean lobby. "My name is Sandra Pierce. I'm calling from Meridian Trust and Securities. I'm contacting you as a courtesy before market open to inform you that all accounts associated with your current authorization codes have been flagged for administrative review. Transfers have been suspended pending resolution." Vincent sat up. "What accounts?" "All accounts, Mr. Moretti. I'm looking at the flag log right now. The action was initiated at 2:17 this morning through a standing legal instruction that was activated in response to a qualifying trigger event." A pause. "The trigger event, according to our records, appears to have been the execution of a divorce filing in the state of New York." The room felt different. He didn't fully understand why yet, but his body understood before his brain caught up. His chest had gone tight. His hands were suddenly very aware of themselves, and the particular animal part of him that had kept him alive through 20 years of building an empire in a world that kills careless men was sending a signal he couldn't quite decode yet. "Who initiated it?" he said. Not a question. "The standing instruction is held under a corporate trustee authority registered to Cross Meridian Capital Management." Another pause. The signatory authority on the original instrument, Mr. Moretti, appears to be your wife. He didn't respond immediately. Your former wife, the woman corrected, with the faintest note of something that might have been satisfaction, as of last evening. He hung up and called Damien. No answer. He called his bank's emergency line. He called his primary attorney, Marcus Reeves, who answered on the second ring with the voice of a man who had already been awake for some time and had news he did not want to deliver. "Vincent, I was about to call you. Talk. I've been getting calls for the last hour. Harrington Consolidated. Frozen. The Coastal Bridge subsidiaries. Frozen. The Real Estate Trust Network. All of it?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside Vincent's window, the sky over Manhattan was the particular shade of pre-dawn gray that makes the whole city look like something that hasn't quite decided to exist yet. "I'm still cataloging," Marcus said. "But Vincent, everything I've checked so far is frozen. Every legitimate holding we can identify. The investment funds are under administrative review flags. The corporate accounts, the executives at 3 different companies have reported being locked out of their systems this morning. Whatever this is, it's..." He stopped. "Say it." "It's comprehensive. It's not targeted. It's not one account or one institution. Someone built this very carefully over a very long time, and whatever was holding it in check, whatever was keeping the trigger from being pulled, stopped holding it at 2:17 this morning. The divorce filing had been time-stamped at 2:17. Evelyn had signed the papers at 8:41 the previous evening. Someone, some system, some legal instrument, some carefully engineered mechanism built into the architecture of his own empire, had waited approximately 6 hours after she signed those papers, and then, at the precise moment the filing was processed and time-stamped in the system of the New York County Clerk's office, had activated. Like a switch. Like something that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this. Vincent Moretti stood in his bedroom at 5:51 in the morning, the Manhattan skyline gray and lightless through the window, his champagne headache still a dull pressure behind his eyes, and understood for the first time that he had made a catastrophic mistake, but not yet what kind of mistake it was, or how deep it went, or how long Evelyn Cross had been building the walls around it while he stood in the center of his own story, convinced he was the only one with a plan. He called Damien again. Still no answer. He called Carlo and told him to find out where Damien was. Carlo called back 11 minutes later, sounding like a man who had been running. "He's not at home, sir. His housekeeper says he left last night around midnight. He hasn't been back." Vincent stood very still. In his chest, something shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something that felt like the first second after you realize you've been played in a game you thought you were winning, when the board reveals itself and you see, suddenly and with complete clarity, that the pieces you thought were yours were never yours at all. "Find him," Vincent said. He dressed quickly and rode down in the private elevator and walked out through the Harrington service entrance into the gray morning, and the city was already awake around him. Trucks making deliveries, a woman walking a dog, a man in a transit vest standing at the corner reading something on his phone. And none of them looked at him, and none of them knew that the man moving through their morning had just woken up inside a trap. He just didn't know yet whose trap it was. He didn't know yet that the answer had been standing 12 feet away from him the night before, holding divorce papers with a steady hand and a face made of something harder and more patient than anything he'd ever had the intelligence to build. His phone rang. Marcus again. "Vincent, the Northfield Industrial Trust? The one that holds the Port Newark operations? The comptroller just called. He can't access the operating accounts. Vincent, I need you to understand something." A pause that lasted long enough for the city noise to fill the gap. A bus, a horn, the percussive machinery of a normal morning that felt suddenly like it belonged to a different world entirely. This isn't an attack from outside. The legal structures that have been frozen. I've spent the last 40 minutes looking at the filing histories on 3 of these entities, and the control instruments that triggered these freezes were built into the original incorporation documents. They've been there for years. Someone spent years building this into the framework of your own companies, Vincent, and you... He stopped. "And I what?" Vincent said. "And you signed all of it," Marcus said quietly. Every filing, every amendment, every operating agreement. Your signature is on all of it, which means you authorized everything that just happened to you. The morning light was coming up over the buildings to the east. Vincent Moretti stood on the sidewalk outside the Harrington Grand Hotel, the city waking up around him, and listened to the sound of his empire locking its own doors against him, and understood, with the particular clarity that only catastrophe provides, that he had never actually understood what he owned. He had only understood what he had been allowed to believe he owned. And the woman who had built the distinction between those two things had just walked away from him with perfect posture and wished his guests a pleasant evening. And somewhere in this city right now she was awake and calm, and had been waiting for exactly this morning for longer than he could yet comprehend. His phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize, a New York area code, no name. He answered it. Silence for a moment. Then, "You should have read what you signed, Vincent." Evelyn's voice, even, unhurried, the same voice she'd used every morning for 20 years across a breakfast table he'd stopped paying attention to. The line went dead before he could speak. Across the city, in the clean glass offices of Cross Meridian Capital, on the 43rd floor of a building on Park Avenue that bore her family name on its lobby directory, a building Vincent had driven past hundreds of times without once asking what happened inside it, Evelyn Cross set her phone on her desk and looked out at the Manhattan morning coming up gold and cold over the East River and permitted herself, for just a moment, the smallest and most private of smiles. Then she picked up her coffee and opened her laptop and went back to work. There were still several things left to dismantle, and somewhere in the city, a man named Damian Wolfe had not yet answered his phone, which meant that the second half of what Evelyn knew was still waiting to be revealed. And when it came, it would not simply end Vincent Moretti's empire. It would expose the person who had been planning to steal it long before Vincent ever decided to hand her the opportunity. The call lasted 4 seconds. Vincent stood on the sidewalk outside the Harrington Grand and stared at the phone in his hand like it had bitten him. Around him the city moved at its normal pace, a cab blowing through a yellow light, a food cart vendor cranking open his awning, 2 women in scrubs walking fast toward the hospital 2 blocks north. And none of it had any relationship to the fact that his world had just folded in on itself while he slept. He called the number back. It rang 7 times and went to a voicemail inbox that was full. He put the phone in his pocket and stood there breathing, his jaw working, the cold morning air doing nothing for the heat that had begun behind his sternum and was spreading upward into his throat. He was a man who had been threatened before. He had been threatened by people who had guns and the will to use them, by federal prosecutors with thick files and hungry eyes, by rival families who considered his territory an insult to their patients. He knew what threat felt like in his body and how to metabolize it. The adrenaline into focus, the fear into calculation, the impulse to react into the discipline of response. This felt different. This felt like opening the wall of your house and finding the architecture had been replaced while you weren't looking, like the supports were different, like the load was being carried somewhere else entirely. He got in the car that Carlo had waiting and told the driver to take him to the office on Fulton Street. The above-ground offices, the legitimate ones, the ones with the right signage and the right lobby and the right employees who had the right clearances, and spent the 20-minute ride calling every attorney on his roster. Marcus was still working the problem. 2 others weren't answering. One answered and had nothing new. One answered and had worse news. The investment trust that held the Moretti family's art collection and real estate portfolio, 47 properties across 5 states, assessed at over $900 million combined, had been placed under a temporary administrative injunction filed by a legal entity Marcus had never heard of, Cross Meridian Capital Management. Vincent had heard of it. He just hadn't known what it was. "Pull everything we have on Cross Meridian," he told Carlo, who was riding in the passenger seat with a laptop open on his knees. "Registration principles, filing history, everything," Carlo typed. The city scrolled past the windows. "Sir," Carlo said, after about 90 seconds, in the voice of someone who has found something he doesn't know how to explain. "What?" "Cross Meridian Capital Management, Delaware Corporation, originally filed 11 years ago." Carlo paused. The registered agent at filing was a legal firm called Hargrove and Stern. The principal officer listed at original incorporation is... He stopped. Carlo. Evelyn Cross Moretti, sir. Vincent looked out the window. It's not a shell, Carlo continued, the words coming faster now, with the slightly breathless quality of someone reading as they go and processing what they're reading in real time. It's registered with the SEC as an investment advisor. It manages assets. It has a staff directory. It has a physical address. It has filings going back a decade. The AUM listed in their most recent regulatory disclosure is, another pause, $41 billion. The car was quiet for a moment. Say that again, Vincent said. $41 billion under management. Sir, this is a major institutional investment firm. It's been operating for over a decade. I'm looking at their regulatory footprint right now, and it's significant, really significant. Vincent said nothing. Outside, Manhattan moved past the windows, indifferent. His wife had built a $41 billion investment firm over the course of their marriage, and he had not known it existed. The heat behind his sternum had changed quality. It was no longer anger exactly. It was something more confused than anger, a kind of vertigo, the mental equivalent of a step you think is there that isn't, when the floor drops 6 inches and your body has to catch itself from the inside. The Fulton Street office was already in chaos when he arrived. He could feel it before he walked in, the altered energy of a building full of people who have been awake since before dawn trying to solve a problem none of them fully understand. His office manager, a precise woman in her 50s named Helen, who had worked for him for 12 years and prided herself on a composure that Vincent had always taken for granted, met him at the elevator with a face that told him everything before she opened her mouth. How bad? He said. Operating accounts for 7 of the 12 corporate subsidiaries are inaccessible as of this morning. I've been on the phone with 3 banks. All of them are citing the same language, administrative review pending resolution of a controlling authority dispute. She walked with him toward his office, keeping pace, her voice low and efficient. Marcus Reeves is sending over a summary of the affected entities. The list is... She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, which from Helen was the equivalent of another person visibly flinching. It's longer than anyone expected. Where's Damien? We've been unable to reach him. He stopped walking. Helen stopped with him. Since when? His assistant last had contact at 9:15 last night, before the party ended. She met his eyes. His car is not at his home. His phone is going to voicemail. We've attempted his emergency contact numbers. Nothing. Vincent held her gaze for a moment, then walked into his office and closed the door. He stood in the center of the room, his room, the one he'd occupied for 15 years, with the Manhattan view he'd built his aesthetic identity around. The photographs and the case of commendations and the various artifacts of a life organized around the performance of power, and felt the space differently than he ever had before, like it was a stage set, like the walls were thinner than they'd looked. His phone rang. Marcus. Talk. I've been through the incorporation documents for 8 of the affected entities, Marcus said without preamble. The ones I can access. Vincent. I need you to understand the scope of what I'm looking at. The sound of papers. In each of these companies, Coastal Bridge LLC, the Harrington Industrial Trust, the Port Newark Operations Group, Northfield Holdings, the Bellamy Real Estate Consortium, there is a class of shares designated in the original documents as founding control shares. They carry enhanced voting rights. In every case, those shares are held by a trustee entity. Cross Meridian. A pause. You knew. I figured it out 20 minutes ago. Then you understand that Evelyn, or Cross Meridian acting under her direction, has legal controlling authority over every one of these companies. Not operational control, voting control, which means she can block transactions, freeze operating accounts, initiate administrative reviews, and file injunctions preventing asset transfers. She doesn't need a judge's permission to do most of this. It was built into the documents at incorporation. She just needed the trigger. The divorce filing, Marcus confirmed. There's a clause in the trustee agreement for the founding control shares. a clause that was apparently included in all of them. If Evelyn Cross Moretti files for dissolution of marriage, or if she is served divorce papers that she executes, either condition, the trustee authority upgrades from passive to active, meaning Cross Meridian goes from holding the shares in a dormant advisory capacity to actively exercising the voting rights. Vincent sat down in his chair. "How long?" he said. "How long has this been in the documents?" "The earliest one I can find dates to about 16 years ago, Northfield Holdings, incorporated with this language in the founding documents." Marcus's voice had taken on the particular quality of a lawyer who is processing something he finds professionally staggering. "Vincent, 16 years ago, someone built a legal kill switch into your own company, and you signed the document that put it there." The silence stretched. "Someone built it," Vincent said, "or someone designed it." "There's a difference?" "Damien handled the incorporation paperwork on all of these entities," Vincent said. "Every single one. I signed what he put in front of me." Another silence, longer this time. "Vincent," Marcus said carefully, "are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Vincent said. "Find me everything you can on the trustee arrangement between Damien's team and Cross Meridian. Every document, every filing, every communication you can legally access. I need to know whose idea this was and whose hands built it." He hung up and sat in the quiet of his office for a long moment, his hands flat on the desk in front of him, his breathing deliberate. He was a man who had always trusted his body's instincts over his mind's rationalizations, and right now his body was telling him something he didn't want to fully think yet, that the shape of what was happening was not the shape he'd assumed when he woke up. He'd assumed Evelyn had done this, built this, and she had. That part was clearly true. But the question that was now pressing at the back of his skull with increasing urgency was this: had she built it alone? And had she built it against him? Or had she built it over 16 years of quiet, invisible work to protect the Empire from something she could see coming that he couldn't? The door opened without a knock. Vanessa. She was dressed sharply. Different clothes than last night, which meant she'd gone home and changed and come here, which meant she'd been awake and moving since before Vincent called anyone. She closed the door behind her and crossed the room without waiting for an invitation, and sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at him with an expression that he was only now, in this context, in this morning's particular light, starting to read correctly. "Where are we?" she said. "Not how are you, not are you all right. Where are we?" "Tell me how much you know," Vincent said. Her eyes didn't change. That was the tell. A person who doesn't know what you mean looks confused for at least a half second when you say something like that. Vanessa's eyes stayed exactly where they were. "I know the accounts are frozen," she said. "I know it's Evelyn. How long until your lawyers can reverse it?" "That depends on what I find out in the next few hours." "What's to find out?" "She executed a legal maneuver. Your lawyers counter it. It takes time, but it's reversible." "Is it?" She leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not sure yet what I'm looking at," Vincent said. "And I'm not sure everyone in this room has been honest with me about what they knew before this morning." Her jaw tightened by a fraction, just a fraction. But Vincent was a man who had spent his life reading the millimeter-level signals in other people's faces, and he caught it the way you catch a reflection in a dark window, briefly, but clearly. "That's an interesting thing to say to me," Vanessa said. "After last night. Last night, I made a decision based on information I had at the time. And now? Now I'm getting more information." She stood up. The movement was controlled, too controlled actually, the specific quality of motion that belongs to someone managing their reaction rather than having it. "I'm going to assume you're under enormous stress, and that's why this conversation sounds the way it sounds," she said. "Call me when you know more." She left. Vincent watched the door close behind her and stayed very still for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called a man named Ray Costello, who was not a lawyer and not a captain, and not anyone who appeared on any organizational chart, but who had been Vincent's personal intelligence resource for 11 years, and who found things that other people could not find and delivered them without embellishment or editorial. "I need everything on Vanessa Hale," Vincent said when Ray answered. "Not the surface file, the real one. Financials, associations, communications history, wherever you can get it. And Ray, I need it fast. How fast? Yesterday. He put the phone down and pulled up the contact list on his desk terminal and looked at the name he'd been avoiding since the moment he woke up. Then he picked up the desk phone, the landline, the one that wasn't logged through his corporate system, and dialed Damian Wolf's personal cell number. It rang. On the fourth ring, it picked up. Silence. Damian, Vincent said. A breath. Then, Vincent. The voice was wrong. Not the voice itself. That was the same, the measured, slightly academic quality that had always characterized Damian's speech, but the quality beneath it, the texture of it, something missing from it. The performance of calm that Damian had always maintained like a professional habit was absent, and what was underneath was something rawer and less rehearsed. Where are you? Vincent said. That's not a conversation for the phone. Then tell me where to be. A pause long enough to be its own answer. Vincent, some of what you're going to find out in the next few days, I need you to understand the context before you. Damian, Vincent's voice had dropped into a register that the people who knew him best would have recognized as the one he used when he had stopped negotiating. Where are you? Another silence. The Meridian Club on 54th, Damian said. Private dining, noon. The line went dead. Vincent looked at his watch. It was 7:22 in the morning. He had 4 hours and 38 minutes, and the shape of those hours felt like the kind of time that passes differently. Slower and more detailed, each minute longer than it should be, the way time moves when a person is waiting for something they can't yet name but can feel coming. He had his driver take him home to change. He stood in the shower for longer than usual, the water hot enough to be uncomfortable, and let the heat work on the muscles in his shoulders and neck that had been locked since the phone call at 5:47. He dried off and dressed deliberately. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of presentational choices that signal a meeting where formality has been suspended because something more fundamental is being discussed. His phone was on the bathroom counter and it buzzed 3 times while he was dressing. He checked it only after he'd finished. The first message was from Marcus. 12 additional entities flagged since our last call. Total now at 22 affected holdings. The second was from Carlo. Damian Wolf's personal financial records show 3 wire transfers from offshore accounts totaling approximately $47 million in the past 6 months. Source unclear. Working to trace. The third was from a number he didn't recognize. A Manhattan area code, no name. He opened it. It was a photograph. The photograph showed a restaurant table. Across the table from each other, in what appeared to be a private dining setting. Intimate, expensive, the kind of place where the lighting is specifically designed to discourage recognition, were 2 people. One was Damian Wolf. The other was Vanessa Hale. The photograph was time-stamped 14 months ago. Vincent sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a long time. The shapes were assembling now. Not completely. There were still missing pieces. Still questions whose answers he couldn't yet see. But the outline was becoming visible, the way a figure emerges from fog not all at once, but edge by edge, detail by detail, until suddenly the whole shape is there and you understand you should have seen it sooner. He texted Ray. Photo just came in. Unknown sender. I need to know who took it and when and why. He put the phone in his pocket and went downstairs. In the car on the way to Fulton Street, he sat in the back and looked out the window and thought about Damian Wolf. 17 years. 17 years of trust, of the particular intimacy that develops between a man and the person who handles the financial architecture of everything he owns. The relationship that requires more vulnerability than almost any other because it requires showing the full picture of what you have and how it's held. Damian had known everything. Every holding, every account, every structure, every piece of legal plumbing that connected the Moretti fortune to the legitimate economy. He had also, apparently, known Evelyn's architect. Or been her architect, or something in between that Vincent didn't yet have language for. His captains were assembled in the Fulton Street conference room when he arrived. 4 of them. Sal Greco, who handled the waterfront operations, Tommy Branca, who ran the union contracts, Pete Aldano, whose territory covered the Bronx and northern Manhattan, and Frank Sorrento, who had been with Vincent the longest of any of them, and whose face right now carried the expression of a man standing in a room where something has caught fire, and he can smell it, but not yet see the flames. Vincent sat at the head of the table. He looked at each of them in turn. "You've all been briefed," he said. Not a question. "We know what we know," Sal said. "Accounts are frozen. The lawyers are working it. What we don't know is who did this and whether it's coming from outside." "It's not coming from outside." The room shifted. "The Castellanos?" Tommy said. "No." "Then who?" "It's internal," Vincent said. "It's a legal mechanism built into the corporate structures. Someone built it there over a period of years, and it was triggered by the divorce filing." Silence. Frank Sorrento leaned forward. He was 61 years old and had a face like a fist, compressed, angular, every surface having absorbed something at some point. He'd been in this world long enough to recognize the shape of different kinds of trouble, and the shape he was seeing now was not one he'd encountered before. "Vincent, are you telling me that someone inside our organization built a mechanism to take down our own financial structure and hide it inside our own documents?" "That appears to be what I'm telling you." "Damien," Frank said. It wasn't a question either. "I'm meeting with him at noon." "Alone?" "Yes." Frank looked at him for a moment. "I'd like to have someone in the building." "Have someone in the building," Vincent said. "Not in the room." The meeting lasted another 40 minutes, covering operational contingencies. What could be kept running on cash reserves? What needed to be suspended? What obligations had hard deadlines that couldn't be deferred? Tommy had already been on the phone with 3 of the union representatives and was managing expectations. Pete's territory was least affected because most of its operations ran through informal channels anyway. Sal's waterfront contracts were the most immediately threatened because they required regular banking transactions that were now frozen. None of it was small. All of it was manageable for 30 days. Longer than that was a different conversation. When the captains left, Vincent spent an hour on the phone with his lawyers, his accountants, and 2 outside consultants Marcus had brought in to assess the legal architecture of the freeze. The picture that emerged from those conversations was consistent and bleak. The control instruments that Evelyn had built into the corporate structures were not just legally solid. They were, by the assessment of everyone who had now examined them, extraordinarily sophisticated. The work of someone with a comprehensive understanding of corporate law, trust instruments, voting rights structures, and the specific legal triggers that could be embedded in founding documents and remain dormant for years without raising any red flags. "In my 20 years of practice," one of the outside consultants said, "I've seen hostile takeover instruments and poison pill provisions and shareholder rights plans, but I have never seen anything built quite like this. The elegance of it is, it's remarkable. It doesn't look like a weapon. It looks like ordinary corporate governance. Until it isn't." Vincent asked him how long it would take to reverse. The consultant was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own answer. "That depends on whether the controlling shareholder, Cross Meridian, your former wife, is willing to cooperate with a negotiated unwinding. If she is, weeks. If she isn't," he paused. "Mr. Moretti, some of these instruments may not be reversible without her consent. She has legal authority over the controlling votes. Without those votes, you can't unwind the trust structures. Without unwinding the trust structures, you can't regain operational authority over the accounts. It's designed to be self-sustaining." Vincent hung up. He ate nothing. He drank 2 cups of coffee and stared at the Manhattan skyline through the glass wall of his office and thought about Evelyn. Not the Evelyn he'd been married to for 20 years, the version he'd constructed in his mind over those years, the quiet woman managing the periphery of his life, but the Evelyn that the morning's information was building in her place, layer by layer. The woman who had been, for 16 years at minimum, doing something else entirely. Building something else entirely, not beside him, parallel to him. In the same space, visible if he'd ever looked, invisible because he never had. At 11:45, he left for the Meridian Club. The private dining room was on the 2nd floor, accessible through a separate entrance that opened onto 54th Street. Frank had a man outside. Vincent went in alone. Damien was already there. He looked like a man who had not slept. The impeccable presentation that was Damien Wolf's professional signature, the perfectly knotted tie, the pressed suit, The composed and analytical face had partially collapsed. His jacket was on the chair beside him. His collar was open. He had a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. Vincent sat down across from him and said nothing. Damien looked at him. His eyes were carrying something that Vincent, in 17 years, had never seen in them before. Something that sat somewhere between calculation and something raw, more human. That might have been guilt, if Damien Wolf was the kind of man who was capable of guilt. "I want to show you something before you say anything," Damien said. He reached into the briefcase beside his chair and placed a manila envelope on the table between them. He slid it toward Vincent. He did not speak. Vincent opened the envelope. Inside were 37 pages of financial documents, wire transfer records, shell company registration filings, a series of emails printed on plain paper, an account ledger showing transactions across an 18-month period. He read through them slowly. Damien didn't rush him. The documents described, in the meticulous detail of financial records, the movement of approximately $260 million through a series of offshore shell companies. The shell companies were connected to a parent entity. The parent entity's ultimate beneficial owner, the person who, under the surface of the corporate structure, actually controlled the money, was identified in a filing with a Pacific Island regulatory authority that had somewhat more flexible disclosure requirements than American jurisdictions. The name on the filing was not Damien Wolf, it was Vanessa Hale. Vincent set the last page down. The room was very quiet. The Meridian Club operated with the specific hush of establishments designed for conversations that cannot be overheard, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the larger dining room below them. "How long have you known?" Vincent said. "I started suspecting 8 months ago," Damien said. "I confirmed it 4 months ago." He picked up his water glass, looked at it, put it back down without drinking. "Vincent, I need you to understand what she's been doing, what the actual plan was." "Tell me." Damien's eyes were steady now. Whatever had been loose in them when Vincent arrived had been gathered back in. Vanessa Hale has been in contact with 3 federal prosecutors over the past 2 years. She's been providing information about our operations, about the family's financial structure, about specific transactions that the federal government would very much like to document. She's been building a case. He paused. Not because she cares about the law, because the deal she made, the deal I found evidence of 4 months ago, is that in exchange for her cooperation, she would receive a grant of immunity and a finder's arrangement on any assets forfeited in a federal prosecution. A percentage, a significant percentage. Vincent looked at him. "She came to you," Damien said, "because she needed a way into the family's financial records, because the federal case needs documentation that the prosecutors can't subpoena without tipping us off. She needed access to the actual internal records, and the fastest way to get access to those records was to get close to me," Vincent said, "was to get close enough that you would show her things you wouldn't show anyone else. Trust her with things you wouldn't trust anyone else with." Damien stopped. "Vincent, she has been copying documents from your personal office for at least 6 months. I have evidence of 3 separate instances." The silence between them had a different quality now. It was the silence of something settling, not resolved, not over, but arrived at a new floor, a new level of understanding that changed the geometry of everything else. "And the divorce," Vincent said. "Did she push for it?" Damien looked at the table. "Damien." "She knew about the control instruments in the corporate structures," Damien said quietly. "She found references to them in the documents she copied from your office. She understood that if Evelyn's divorce trigger activated, it would freeze your assets. He stopped. "She wanted the assets frozen," Vincent said. "She wanted my operation paralyzed." A paralyzed operation with frozen accounts and federal prosecution incoming is significantly easier to dismantle and claim forfeiture on than a functioning one, Damien said. "Yes." Vincent sat back in his chair. The full shape of it was visible now, all of it, the elegant, vicious completeness of a plan that had used his own arrogance as its primary instrument, that had counted on his inability to see Evelyn clearly, had counted on his willingness to be flattered into decisions that served someone else's agenda, had counted on the specific blindness of a powerful man who had stopped looking at his own life because he was too busy performing it. Vanessa had not wanted him. She had wanted the wreckage, and she had used him to create it. "Why are you bringing this to me?" Vincent said. "Now." After hiding it for 4 months, Damien met his eyes. "Because 3 days ago, a federal grand jury was convened in the Southern District of New York," he said, "and my name is on the subpoena list." The water glass sat between them on the white tablecloth, still untouched, perfectly still, reflecting the light from the window in a thin, bright line across its surface, like a wire pulled taut. Vincent looked at it. "Show me everything you have," he said, and Damien reached back into the briefcase and placed another envelope on the table. Thicker than the first, heavy with the particular weight of documents that have been gathered at personal risk over a long period of time by a man who, whatever else he was, had understood for 4 months that the moment would come when they were the only thing standing between him and a federal indictment. Vincent opened it, and in the margin of the second page, in handwriting he didn't recognize, was a name he did. A legal firm. 3 words, 2 of which were the surnames of the partners, and the third of which was the word that made his jaw go tight and his hands go still on the paper. The firm's address was on Park Avenue, the same block as Cross Meridian Capital, the same building, in fact. He checked the address twice to be sure, as the offices where Evelyn had answered her phone at 5:47 that morning and told him in 4 seconds of silence and 1 sentence that he should have read what he signed. Vincent set the page down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady and you don't want anyone to see it. "This firm," he said, "Hargrove and Stern." "Evelyn's registered agent since Cross Meridian's founding," Damien said. "They also appear in Vanessa's shell company filings. Same firm, different clients." He paused. "Whether that means Evelyn knew about Vanessa, or whether Vanessa simply used the same firm because it appeared in documents she copied, I don't know." Vincent looked at the page again. Same firm. 2 women. One who had spent 16 years building a fortress inside his empire without his knowledge. One who had spent 2 years dismantling it from the outside with the federal prosecutor's quiet cooperation. Whether those 2 facts were connected or merely parallel was the question that now sat at the center of everything. The question that determined whether Evelyn was the solution to what Vanessa had set in motion or whether she was part of something Vincent still couldn't see the full shape of. He closed the envelope. "I need to meet with her," he said. "Evelyn?" "Today." Damien looked at him for a moment. "She won't take your call." "Then find me someone she will take a call from," Vincent said, standing, buttoning his jacket with the deliberate composure of a man reassembling himself in real time. "Because in approximately 72 hours, based on what you've just told me about that grand jury, federal investigators are going to start pulling on threads that lead directly back to every legitimate business Evelyn built. And whether she knows it or not, her architecture is wrapped around mine, which means when mine burns, hers catches." He picked up his phone. "She needs to know that," he said, "and I need to know which side of this she's actually on." He walked out without waiting for Damien's response, through the quiet of the Meridian Club's 2nd floor and down the stairs and out onto 54th Street where the city hit him full in the face, noise and exhaust and the indifferent machinery of a normal afternoon. And for the first time since 5:47 that morning, Vincent Moretti felt something sharper than anger or vertigo, or the nauseating clarity of understanding how badly he'd been played. He felt afraid. Not for himself, for what happened next, if the woman who had built everything worth saving decided she had no reason left to save any of it. His phone buzzed. Ray Costello. 1 line of text. The photo was taken by a private investigator hired 11 months ago. The client who hired him was Evelyn Cross Moretti. Vincent read it twice. She had known about Vanessa and Damien for almost a year. She had known, and she had signed those divorce papers anyway, which meant everything Evelyn had done since 5:47 this morning was not reaction. It was the final move in a plan she had already finished building. She had known for 11 months. Vincent sat in the back of the car on 54th Street and read Ray's text 4 more times, and each time the sentence rearranged itself slightly in his understanding. Not the words, which didn't change, but the weight of them, which kept increasing the way pressure increases as you go deeper into something. Evelyn had hired a private investigator 11 months ago. The investigator had photographed Damien and Vanessa together at a private dinner, which meant that 11 months ago Evelyn had already suspected enough to pay someone to confirm it, which meant that for nearly a year she had known what was building around her, around both of them, and had said nothing, done nothing visible, given no signal that she was aware of anything at all. She had hosted dinners. She had managed the social calendar. She had stood at his side at 4 separate formal events in the past 11 months, and smiled at the right people and said the right things and looked, to every person in every room, exactly like what Vincent had always told himself she was. The whole time she had been watching, the whole time she had been finishing something. He told his driver to take him to Park Avenue. The building that housed Cross Meridian Capital was 44 stories of glass and dark steel, the kind of architecture that announces itself through restraint rather than spectacle. No ornamentation, no decorative ambition, just the clean vertical authority of a structure that doesn't need to perform. The lobby directory listed 14 tenants. Cross Meridian Capital Management occupied floors 40 through 43. The name on the directory was rendered in the same typeface as every other tenant, the same size, the same weight. Nothing about it announced itself as significant. Vincent stood in the lobby and looked at it for a moment. Then he went to the security desk and gave his name and asked to see Evelyn Cross-Moretti. The guard, young, professional, the particular brand of compose that comes from training rather than experience, picked up a phone and spoke quietly into it and listened, and then looked at Vincent with an expression of practiced neutrality. "Ms. Cross is available," he said. "42nd floor. Someone will meet you at the elevator." Ms. Cross, not Mrs. Moretti, not even Mrs. Cross Moretti. Ms. Cross. He rode the elevator up in silence. His reflection in the polished elevator doors looked back at him. Dark suit, jaw set, eyes carrying something he didn't fully recognize in himself. He looked like a man arriving at a negotiation he wasn't sure he could win, which was not a look he was accustomed to seeing on his own face. The doors opened on 42. A woman was waiting, early 40s, dark blazer, the efficient posture of someone whose job involves managing access to important things. She introduced herself as Claire and led him through a floor that was everything the lobby had promised and more. Clean lines, serious people, the quiet, purposeful hum of an organization that has long since stopped proving itself and is simply operating. Analysts at workstations. A glass-walled conference room where 4 people in expensive clothes were examining something on a large screen. A corridor lined with the kind of art that gets purchased because it holds value, rather than because anyone particularly loves it. It looked, Vincent thought, exactly like what it apparently was. A major institutional investment firm. Built, piece by piece, over 11 years by his wife, while he had been building something else entirely and taking all the credit for it. Claire stopped at a set of double doors at the end of the corridor and knocked once, and opened them without waiting for a response, which told Vincent that Evelyn had already said to send him in. The office was corner-facing, 2 walls of glass overlooking the intersection of Park and 52nd, the city spread out below in the particular way that height renders a place both intimate and abstract. The desk was large and clean, almost nothing on it except a laptop, a notepad, and a single cup of coffee. The chairs were leather, dark gray, arranged in a conversation grouping near the windows rather than in the subordinate positioning across the desk that Vincent used in his own office. Evelyn was standing at the window when he came in. She was dressed differently than last night. A charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked like what she was, which was the chief executive of a $41 billion investment firm who had been at work since before dawn, and the dissonance between that fact and every story Vincent had told himself about her for 2 decades created a kind of cognitive vertigo that he had to actively suppress. She didn't turn around immediately. She let him come into the room. She let him hear the door close behind him. She let the silence establish itself for approximately 4 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough not to be theatrical. And then she turned. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been expecting a thing for a long time and is now simply noting its arrival. "Vincent," she said. "You knew," he said. "Sit down. You knew about Vanessa and Damien for 11 months, and you said nothing." "Sit down," she said again, the same tone, no elevation in it, no particular emphasis. The tone of someone who will repeat a reasonable request exactly once more before it stops being a request. He sat, She crossed to the conversation grouping and took the chair across from him and set her coffee on the low table between them. She did not sit the way people sit when they're nervous. She sat the way people sit in rooms they own. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything. Can you do that?" "Depends on what it is." "Vincent." He looked at her. "Talk." She reached beside her chair and picked up a slim black portfolio from the floor and set it on the table and opened it. Inside were documents, a thin stack, clean pages, the kind of materials that have been prepared in advance for exactly this meeting. 11 months ago, I hired a firm to investigate Vanessa Hale, she said. Not because I cared about the relationship. I want to be clear about that from the start. I didn't care about the relationship. She said it without bitterness, without the particular inflection of a wounded person performing indifference. She said it the way she might say she didn't care about a weather system, as a factual statement about the interior state of a person who had done a great deal of private reckoning over a long period of time and had arrived at a place of genuine clarity. I cared because something in the financial monitoring I maintain on the family's legitimate holdings flagged an anomaly 6 weeks before I hired the investigator. A pattern of data access on documents related to our corporate structures. Someone was reading things they shouldn't have been able to read. "Damien," Vincent said. "I thought so initially, but the access pattern was wrong for Damien. He had legitimate access to most of those documents. The person reading them was going through channels that suggested they were being shown documents, or shown where to find them, rather than accessing them directly." She paused. "It took 3 weeks to narrow the access point. When I did, it originated from your personal office network." Vincent's hands were very still on his knees. "Someone with access to your personal office," Evelyn said, "was reading documents about our corporate structure that they had no professional reason to read. At that point, I hired the investigator." She turned a page in the portfolio. "What he found in the first 2 weeks was the relationship between Vanessa and Damien. What he found in the following 9 months was considerably more." She slid the first document across the table. It was a timeline, 41 months, rendered in clean columns, dates, events, names, financial figures. Vincent looked at it and felt the particular sensation of a picture coming into focus that you had been holding too close to see properly, when suddenly the distance is right and the image resolves, and you cannot understand how you missed it from where you were standing. "Damien Wolfe has been moving money through offshore structures for 4 years, Evelyn said. "Not our money, not yet. He was building the infrastructure, establishing the channels, rehearsing the architecture, in a sense, using smaller amounts he could explain away if they were ever noticed." She turned another page. "Vanessa Hale came into contact with Damien approximately 28 months ago through a mutual connection in the Connecticut real estate community. Their arrangement was formalized, Fika. I have communication records supporting this, approximately 22 months ago." Vincent looked up from the timeline. "What arrangement?" Evelyn met his eyes. "Damien would provide Vanessa with access to the family's financial records and ongoing intelligence about the legitimate holdings. Vanessa would use her federal contacts. She had cultivated a relationship with 2 prosecutors in the Southern District over the preceding 3 years. I have documentation of those meetings to build an asset forfeiture case. When the case was filed and assets were seized, Damien would receive a percentage of whatever Vanessa received under her finder's arrangement with the government." Evelyn closed the portfolio. "They planned to take approximately $400 million out of the legitimate holdings through a combination of asset forfeiture and the offshore structures Damien had been building. The forfeiture would come from the government case. The offshore transfers would happen in the window between the asset freeze and the actual prosecution, when the chaos would make tracking them difficult." The room was very quiet. "And me," Vincent said. His voice was flat. "Where did I fit into this?" Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "You were the case," she said. "Your criminal operation is what the federal case is actually about. Vanessa was never interested in prosecuting you personally. The prosecutors might be, but Vanessa's interest was the forfeiture. The bigger and more visible your operation looked at the moment of indictment, the larger the asset base subject to forfeiture, the larger her percentage." She paused. "She needed you operational, prominent, and exposed, which is exactly what you were." Vincent stood up, He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room and looked out at the city. Park Avenue running south, the mid-morning traffic, the geometry of a place that had been the context of his entire adult life, and that looked right now like something he was seeing from behind glass. "The divorce," he said. "Accelerated the timeline," Evelyn said behind him. "When you filed, it activated my control instruments, which she knew about because Damien had shown her the documents. A frozen legitimate asset base is easier to move against in a forfeiture action than an active one. She needed the freeze. She needed it to happen before the grand jury moved, so that when the indictment came, the assets would already be in a state of administrative limbo that her legal team could exploit. She pushed me toward the divorce," Vincent said. "Over approximately 8 months, yes, strategically, gradually, using the particular methods." Evelyn stopped. "You don't need me to explain the methods." He turned from the window. She was watching him with the expression she'd had when he walked in, that quality of someone who has been waiting for a long time and is now simply present in the moment they were waiting for, without triumph, without pity, without any of the emotions that the situation might have entitled her to display. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. 11 months ago, when you found out." She held his gaze. "Because I wasn't sure yet which parts of it you knew." The sentence landed and stayed. Vincent looked at her. "You thought I was part of it." "I thought it was possible," she said, without flinching. "I had to consider it. A man divorces his wife publicly, humiliates her in front of 300 witnesses, and the effect is to activate legal instruments that paralyze his own financial structure in a way that benefits a federal asset forfeiture case. From the outside, that can look like a man who made a deal. I didn't make a deal. I know that now." "How?" "Because if you had made a deal," Evelyn said, "you would not be sitting in my office this morning looking like a man who has spent the last 4 hours learning that the floor was never where he thought it was." He sat back down. Not because he'd decided to, but because his legs made the decision for him. The particular physical capitulation of a body that has been operating on adrenaline since before sunrise and is now recalculating its reserves. "The grand jury," he said, "has been convened for 6 days, Evelyn said. "I have a contact in the Southern District. I'm not a prosecutor, an administrator, who confirmed the timeline. They are approximately 3 weeks from a sealed indictment." 3 weeks. Maybe less. Vincent rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture so unguarded that it surprised him as he was doing it. The kind of thing you do when you have temporarily forgotten that you are performing composure for an audience. He dropped his hands. "What does Damien know about your level of knowledge?" "Nothing," Evelyn said. "He doesn't know I have any of this. He thinks the control instruments were a passive protection I built years ago, and that their activation was a coincidence of timing. He came to me this morning, with documents. He told me about Vanessa's federal arrangement. He told me about the offshore transfers." Vincent paused. He presented himself as a man turning on Vanessa to protect himself from the grand jury. Something moved in Evelyn's eyes. A recalibration. Quick, almost invisible. The adjustment of someone who has just received a data point that changes a calculation. "What documents did he show you?" she said. Vincent described them. The wire transfers, the shell company filings, the Vanessa Hale beneficial ownership record. Evelyn listened without interrupting, and as he spoke, he watched her face process what he was saying, and what he saw in her face was not confirmation, but something more complicated. A particular focused stillness that he was coming to recognize as what Evelyn Cross looked like when she was working a problem in real time. When he finished, she was quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said, "He showed you records that implicate Vanessa." "Yes." "Did any of those records implicate him?" Vincent thought back through the documents. The wire transfers from offshore accounts. "Source unclear," Carlo had said. The shell company filings under Vanessa's name. The email records between Vanessa and a federal contact. He went through it methodically, the way you inventory a room after someone has been through it, checking for what's present and what's absent. "No," he said slowly, "nothing that directly named him as a principal." Evelyn nodded. One small, precise nod. the kind that belongs to a person who has just had a suspicion confirmed. The documents he showed you are real, she said. I recognize elements of them from my own investigation. Vanessa's involvement with the federal prosecutors is real. The offshore structures are real. She paused. But Damien edited what he showed you. The records he gave you describe Vanessa as the architect of the offshore transfers. In the full record, in what I have, Damien is the architect. Vanessa is the recipient, not the builder. Vincent felt the cold move through him again. He's positioning himself, Vincent said. He's been positioning himself, Evelyn corrected, since at least 4 months ago, which is when he told you he confirmed Vanessa's involvement. He's been building a version of events in which he is the loyal consigliere who discovered the betrayal and brought it to his boss, and Vanessa is the sole architect of the conspiracy. She looked at him steadily. If you walk into a conversation with federal investigators carrying Damien's documents and Damien's story, you corroborate a narrative that puts Vanessa in prison and leaves Damien standing. The shape of it was fully visible now. Every layer of it. The original conspiracy between Damien and Vanessa, Damien's parallel construction of an exit, his own personal escape route built alongside the thing he was doing, so that when it collapsed, he would already be on the other side. His approach to Vincent this morning had not been a man breaking under guilt. It had been the final move in a separate private game that Damien had been playing simultaneously with everything else. He had been playing everyone. Where is he now? Vincent said. I don't know, but Vincent, Evelyn leaned forward slightly, the first change in her posture since he'd sat down. There's something else. Something I found 3 days ago that changes the geometry of all of this. She reached into the portfolio again and removed a single page. She slid it across the table. It was a corporate filing, 1 page, from a Delaware registry, a newly formed LLC, registered 9 days ago. Vincent looked at the principal officer listed. He read the name twice. Then he looked up at Evelyn. That's Marcus Reeves, he said, my attorney. Your attorney, Evelyn said, incorporated a new entity 9 days ago. The registered agent for that entity is the same firm, Hargrove and Stern, that appears in Vanessa's offshore filings and in Cross Meridian's original incorporation documents. She paused. The new LLC has a single described business purpose, listed in its operating agreement. I obtained a copy this morning. What purpose? Asset management consulting services in connection with federal forfeiture proceedings, Evelyn said. The words sat between them like something physical. Marcus Reeves, the man Vincent had called at 5:47 this morning. The man who had spent the last 6 hours cataloging the frozen assets and advising on legal strategy and building, brick by careful brick, a picture of the damage, while simultaneously incorporating a new entity whose single purpose was to consult on the very forfeiture proceeding that damage was designed to serve. He's been feeding information to the prosecution, Vincent said. It wasn't a question. Attorney-client communications are privileged, Evelyn said, but there are ways around privilege when the communication is itself in furtherance of ongoing criminal activity. If Marcus Reeves has been advising federal prosecutors on the structure of your legitimate holdings while simultaneously advising you on those same holdings. She stopped. Every conversation you've had with him since this morning has been a conversation that someone else may also have been listening to. Vincent's phone was on the table. He looked at it. Every call this morning, Marcus, the outside consultants Marcus had brought in, the detailed conversation about the control instruments, the voting rights structures, the timeline for reversing the freeze. All of it delivered to a man who had, 9 days ago, quietly incorporated a consulting entity designed to profit from the federal proceeding that conversation was feeding. He picked up the phone and turned it over in his hands, and then set it back down without touching the screen. I need to understand something, he said, and I need you to tell me the truth. Evelyn waited. The control instruments you built into the corporate structures, he said. The voting rights, the freeze mechanism, the trustee authority under Cross Meridian. You built those 16 years ago, before Damien and Vanessa, before any of this. He looked at her. Why? What were you protecting against? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. A real pause. Not a strategic one, but the kind that belongs to someone deciding how much truth to give to a question that deserves all of it. You, she said. The word was quiet. No edge in it. No accusation. Just the flat, accurate answer to a direct question. I built those protections because I understood from the beginning that everything I was building could be taken from me, she said. Not by rivals, not by federal prosecutors, by you. Because you never read what you signed, because you never asked what I was doing, because the nature of our arrangement, the nature of what you allowed yourself to believe about me and what I contributed, meant that without a legal architecture protecting my work, I had no claim to any of it. She held his gaze. I was your wife, Vincent. In your world, that is not a legal protection. It is a vulnerability. The silence between them had a different quality than any of the silences that had come before in this conversation. It was not the silence of information being processed or conclusions being reached. It was the silence of something true having been said in a room where truth had not been the primary currency for a very long time. The divorce didn't hurt you, he said, slowly, working it out as he said it. The divorce was the event you built for. It activated your protection and transferred operational authority to you before anyone, Damien, Vanessa, Marcus, anyone, could file an injunction to prevent it. Yes. You needed me to file. She didn't answer immediately. Evelyn, he said, did you? He stopped, started again. Vanessa, was she working toward getting me to file, or were you? It was the question he hadn't been able to fully form until this moment, the one that had been pressing at the back of everything since Ray's text, since the Hargrove and Stern connection, since the realization that Evelyn had known for 11 months and had not stopped it. She could have stopped it. At any point in 11 months, she could have walked into his office and told him what she knew and stopped it. She hadn't. She had watched it unfold, completed her preparations, and waited. And on the night of their 20th anniversary, when the divorce papers appeared in his jacket pocket, and Vanessa stood at his side in a red dress, and 300 people witnessed what came next, every piece of what Evelyn had spent 16 years building had activated exactly as designed. She looked at him across the low table in the corner office on the 42nd floor. The city spread behind her in the morning light, and she said, I didn't arrange what happened last night, Vincent. I didn't put the papers in your pocket. I didn't choose the dress you wore or the room you chose to do it in. She paused. But I knew it was coming. I had known for months, and I was ready for it. That's not the same as answering the question. She held his gaze for a long moment. No, she said, it isn't. And in the space where the answer should have been, Vincent Moretti understood something that no document, no timeline, no financial record could have shown him. He understood that the woman sitting across from him was not his enemy, but she was not his ally either, not yet, not automatically, not simply because he had arrived at her office with the correct amount of desperation and the right shape of realization on his face. She was something more precise than either of those things. She was the person who held the only instrument capable of protecting what remained of his legitimate holdings from a federal forfeiture proceeding that was 3 weeks from filing, advised by his own attorney, constructed by his own consigliere, and set in motion by a woman who had used his vanity as the primary lever of a plan that had been running for nearly 2 years. And the only way forward, the only path that did not end in a federal courtroom with everything stripped away, required him to do something that 20 years of being Vincent Moretti had made almost constitutionally impossible. He was going to have to ask her for help, not demand it, not negotiate for it from a position of leverage, not frame it as a transaction or a strategic alliance or a mutually beneficial arrangement. He was going to have to sit in this room and ask the woman he had publicly humiliated in front of 300 people less than 12 hours ago. The woman who had built an empire inside his empire while he told himself she was invisible. The woman who had spent 11 months watching the trap close while completing her own preparations with a patience he could not fully comprehend. He was going to have to ask her, simply and without any leverage at all, for the one thing that could save what remained. He opened his mouth, and his phone lit up on the table between them. Not a call. A text. From a number he didn't recognize, a different unknown number than this morning's, a different area code, somewhere out of state. He turned it over without thinking. The message was 4 words and a file attachment. She flipped on you. He opened the attachment. It was an audio file, 11 minutes and 43 seconds. He looked at Evelyn. She was watching the phone, not his face, which told him she had seen the notification light up and was waiting with the particular stillness of someone who does not know what is coming but has trained herself not to show that. And he pressed play and set the phone on the table between them with the volume up. The recording began with ambient sound. A room. The soft mechanical respiration of a space with climate control and no windows. Then a voice Vincent recognized after approximately 2 syllables. A federal prosecutor named Alan Greer, whose name had appeared in the Southern District's press releases 3 times in the last 18 months in connection with organized crime prosecutions. And then another voice, answering Greer's questions in the measured, cooperative tone of someone who has made a deal and is delivering on it. Evelyn Cross-Moretti's voice. The recording was dated 7 months ago. Vincent's hands went flat on the table. He listened to 40 seconds of it, enough to understand the shape of what it was, enough to hear Evelyn describing, in precise and knowledgeable detail, the structure of the Moretti family's legitimate holdings, the location of specific accounts, the names of specific shell entities. And then he reached out and stopped it. He looked at her. Evelyn's face had not changed. She was looking at the phone with the expression of someone examining a problem, not the expression of someone who has been caught. "How long?" he said. His voice was very quiet. She looked up from the phone and met his eyes. And in the half-second before she answered, Vincent Moretti understood that he had just arrived at the actual bottom of this, the real floor, beneath all the other floors, and that everything he thought he had understood in the last 4 hours had been, once again, the version of the truth that someone else had decided he was ready to receive. "Vincent," she said, "that recording was made under conditions you don't yet have the full context for, and the person who just sent it to you did so because they need you to walk out of this room before I can finish telling you what I actually did with those 7 months." His jaw was tight. Talk fast. She reached back into the portfolio and removed the last document, thicker than the others, bound with a clip, the kind of document that has been prepared by lawyers and reviewed multiple times before being carried into a room like this one. She set it on the table and slid it across. On the cover page in clean block letters were the words, "Proffer Agreement, Cross Meridian Capital Management versus United States Attorney, Southern District of New York, dated 4 months ago." Vincent stared at it. "I didn't give them you," Evelyn said. "I gave them Damien. I gave them Vanessa. I gave them Marcus Reeves." Her voice was even, precise. "And in exchange, every legitimate holding under Cross Meridian's controlling authority, every company I built inside your empire, receives full prosecutorial immunity from asset forfeiture." The city hummed 42 floors below them. "You made a deal," Vincent said. "I made the only deal that protected what was worth protecting," she said. "And I made it before anyone else in this building had the chance to make a worse one with your name in it." He read the proffer agreement in 11 minutes. He read it the way he read everything that mattered. Not linearly, not from the first word to the last, but in the particular non-sequential way of a man trained by decades of survival to locate the operative clause, the binding commitment, the thing that cannot be undone. He moved through the pages with his index finger tracking the text, and his jaw set and his breathing controlled to the specific shallow rhythm he used when he needed his body to stay out of the way of his mind. When he finished, he set it on the table and looked at the window. "Damien and Vanessa," he said. "Marcus. You gave them all 3. Yes. And in exchange, the legitimate holdings under Cross Meridian's authority are immunized from forfeiture." "Fully. What about my criminal operation?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That wasn't mine to protect," she said. "I protected what I built. I couldn't protect what you built. I wouldn't have known how to." He absorbed that. "The recordings," he said. "The 7 months of recordings. What exactly did you give them? Financial architecture? The structure of the shell entities Damien built? The offshore transfer routes? The documentation trail connecting Vanessa's federal contacts to the asset forfeiture scheme?" She paused. "Nothing about your organization's operations. Nothing that could be used to build a RACO case against your captains or your family structure. The proffer is specific. It defines the scope of what I provided and what immunity covers. Your lawyers wrote it that way. My lawyer spent 4 months negotiating it that way, she said. He looked at her. Why? She didn't answer immediately. Evelyn, why did you protect the organization? I didn't protect the organization, she said. I protected the people in it who had nothing to do with what Damien and Vanessa were building. Sal Greco has 4 children. Tommy Branca's wife has been sick for 2 years. I have known these people for 20 years, Vincent. I wasn't going to give a federal prosecutor a map to their front doors to solve a problem that Damien Wolfe created. The room was very quiet. Vincent looked at the woman across the table and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have clean language for. Something that was not gratitude exactly, and not relief, and not the particular emotion that belongs to a man confronting the full measure of what he has failed to see. Something that was all of those things simultaneously and more uncomfortable than any of them individually. His phone buzzed. Ray Costello. He picked it up. Damien Wolfe just entered 26 Federal Plaza. Went in through the side entrance. Someone met him at the door. Vincent read it twice. He showed the screen to Evelyn. She read it. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A tightening, rapid, and almost invisible, the adjustment of a person whose timeline has just been compressed. He's going in, she said. He's going in right now. If he reaches Greer before I can... She stopped, stood up. He doesn't know about the proffer agreement. He doesn't know I've already given them what they need. He's going to walk in there and offer them a version of events that puts you at the center of the forfeiture scheme and himself on the periphery, and if Greer takes the meeting before his office checks the existing proffer. It muddies the water, Vincent said. He was already standing. It doesn't just muddy it. If Damien offers corroborating testimony on the financial structure and frames it differently than my proffer, the prosecution has 2 conflicting accounts from 2 cooperative witnesses, and they use both, which means the immunity scope gets relitigated and the protection I negotiated potentially gets challenged. Vincent was already moving toward the door. You can't go to Federal Plaza, Evelyn said sharply. I'm not going to Federal Plaza. Then what? I'm going to do what I should have done 4 months ago, he said, and picked up his phone and called Frank Sorrento. Frank answered on the first ring. I need you to find Marcus Reeves, Vincent said. Right now. Not tomorrow. Not in an hour. Right now. Bring him to the Fulton Street office and make sure he doesn't make any calls on the way. A pause. How do you want this handled? Carefully, Vincent said. He's still an officer of the court. And Damien? Damien's already in Federal Plaza. He's not our problem right now. Marcus is. He hung up and looked at Evelyn. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet this morning, something more alert than the composed, analytical watchfulness she'd maintained since he walked in. Something that was evaluating him in real time, recalibrating, the way you recalibrate when a variable you'd written off as fixed turns out to be moving. Come with me, he said, to Fulton Street. You have the proffer agreement. You have the full financial documentation. Marcus doesn't know you have it. If we can get him in a room before he realizes Damien is already in Federal Plaza. He'll try to make his own deal, Evelyn said. And we'll be there when he does, Vincent said, with everything you have. And we give him one choice. She picked up the portfolio. They went. The car ride to Fulton Street took 14 minutes in mid-morning traffic, and neither of them spoke for most of it. Vincent sat with his phone in his hand, monitoring texts from Frank and Carlo and Ray. Evelyn sat beside him with the portfolio on her lap and looked out the window. The distance between them on the back seat of the car was approximately 18 inches, and it felt like a different kind of distance than the one that had existed between them for 20 years. Not the distance of indifference, but the charged, complicated distance of 2 people who have just exchanged a great deal of truth in a short period of time and are still processing the weight of it. Frank texted at the 12-minute mark. Got him. He was at the Four Seasons bar, looked surprised, didn't make any calls. Vincent texted back, keep it that way. Marcus Reeves was sitting in the small conference room off the main floor when they arrived. Not Vincent's office, deliberately, a room with no windows and one door and the particular quality of a space where people understand they are not in a position of comfort. Frank was outside the door. Carlo was at the end of the hall. Marcus was alone with a glass of water he wasn't drinking and the expression of a man performing calm over something that was not calm at all. He looked up when the door opened. He saw Vincent first. Then he saw Evelyn. Something happened in his face in the half-second between those two recognitions that was faster than his composure could manage. A contraction, a rapid recalculation, a flicker of something that came and went before it could be named, but that both Vincent and Evelyn saw with complete clarity. "Marcus," Vincent said, and sat down. Evelyn sat beside him and set the portfolio on the table without opening it. Marcus looked at the portfolio. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Vincent. His jaw was working slightly, the kind of involuntary muscular movement that belongs to a person whose mind is running very fast through very few options. "Vincent, I've been trying to reach you." "I know," Vincent said. "You called 4 times this morning. I've been busy. There are developments with the legal situation that I need to brief you on, and with with Evelyn here. I'm not sure this is the appropriate—" "9 days ago," Vincent said, "you incorporated a limited liability company in Delaware. The registered agent was Hargrove and Stern. The described purpose was asset management consulting in connection with federal forfeiture proceedings." He paused. "Would you like to tell me whose forfeiture proceedings you were planning to consult on?" The performance of calm collapsed. It didn't collapse loudly. Marcus Reeves was too practiced a lawyer for loudness. But it collapsed visibly, the specific deflation of a man whose primary defense has just been removed, who is now operating without cover in a room with 2 people who have just demonstrated they know exactly what he has been doing. That's a separate business matter, entirely unrelated to my representation of Marcus. Vincent's voice had dropped into the register that closed conversations rather than opening them. "Stop." Marcus stopped. "Damian Wolf walked into Federal Plaza 45 minutes ago," Vincent said. "He's talking to Alan Greer right now. Whatever deal he's offering, he built it over 4 months, and it is almost certainly designed to position him as the cooperative witness and position you as the attorney who facilitated the financial architecture that made the forfeiture case possible." He leaned forward slightly. "You have about 30 minutes before Greer's office confirms that the existing proffer agreement makes Damian's account redundant. After that, you have nothing left to trade." Marcus's face had gone the color of old concrete. "What existing proffer agreement?" he said. Evelyn opened the portfolio. She slid the agreement across the table. Marcus looked at it. He looked at the date. He looked at the signatory. His hands, which had been flat on the table, moved to his lap. A retreat, a miniaturization, the body folding inward the way bodies do when the mind gives up the pretense of control. "She already made a deal," he said. Not to Vincent. More to the table. 4 months ago, Evelyn said. "The scope of the immunity includes every financial entity under Cross Meridian's controlling authority, which means the documentation of the corporate structures I provided to the prosecution is already part of the record. Whatever you were planning to offer Greer about those structures—" She paused. "He already has it." "What he doesn't have yet," Vincent said, "is the full picture of your role, the new LLC, the prior communications with the prosecution, the specific intelligence you provided from inside attorney-client privilege." He held Marcus's eyes. "But we have it. And right now, you have one option." Marcus looked at him. "Tell us everything," Vincent said. "Not Greer, us. Every conversation you had with the prosecution, every document you passed, every piece of information you pulled from our attorney-client communications and handed to someone who was planning to use it against us. You give us all of it, completely, and right now. And what we do with it is something we'll discuss after we know the full scope. And if I don't, then Frank drives you to Federal Plaza," Vincent said, "and you walk in there and find out that Damian's version of your role is already on the record, and you negotiate from whatever's left after that." The room was silent except for the building's ventilation system and Marcus Reeves's breathing, which had become the labored, conscious breathing of a man working hard to keep his body from broadcasting the full extent of his panic. He talked for 41 minutes. He talked without stopping except when Vincent or Evelyn asked a clarifying question, and those interruptions were infrequent because the account he gave was comprehensive in the way that accounts become comprehensive when a person has been maintaining a deception for a long time and is finally released from the effort of it. He described his first contact with the prosecution 18 months ago, initiated by the prosecution, not by him, through a mutual acquaintance at a legal conference, and the gradual formalization of what had begun as casual conversation about organized crime, financial structures, into a regular intelligence exchange. He described the documents he had copied or summarized from his files on the Moretti holdings. He described 3 specific meetings with Alan Greer in the past 6 months. He described his communications with Damian Wolf, which had been conducted through a method, a shared draft folder in an anonymous email account, that he clearly believed had left no external record. Evelyn was taking notes in a small, precise handwriting on the notepad she'd brought from her office. Vincent sat very still and listened and let the full picture assemble itself in his mind with the patience of a man who has already survived the worst of what the morning had to offer and is now simply cataloging what remains. When Marcus finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Vincent's phone rang. Ray Costello. He answered it. "Damien just came out," Ray said. 43 minutes inside. He's got a car waiting. Vincent, he's heading uptown. I've got eyes on him." "Where uptown?" "Still tracking, but Vincent—" A pause, traffic noise on Ray's end. "He made a call on the way out. I couldn't get audio, but I got the number he dialed." "Whose number?" "It's registered to a shell company in the Caymans, but I cross-referenced it against the records your guy Carlo pulled this morning on Vanessa Hale's financial network." Another pause. "It's her emergency contact line, the one that only gets used when something is wrong enough to break protocol." Vincent stood up. "He's running," Ray said. "I think they're both running. Whatever deal he just made or didn't make in there, he came out and the first thing he did was call her. Which means he didn't get what he wanted," Vincent said. "And now he's cutting to the exit." He looked at Evelyn. She had already closed the notepad and was on her feet. "If they both disappear before the grand jury files the indictment," she said, "the prosecution loses its 2 primary witnesses and the forfeiture case collapses. Without the forfeiture case, there's no immediate federal pressure. But without that pressure—" She stopped. "The deal you made falls apart," Vincent said. "The immunity protections in the proffer are contingent on the case proceeding," she said. "If the case collapses because the witnesses disappear, the prosecution can argue the proffer terms weren't met and refile with a broader scope." Her voice was level, but the words were moving faster than they had all morning. "Vincent, if Damien and Vanessa both disappear in the next 48 hours, I lose the immunity protections on every legitimate holding. Everything I spent 16 years building becomes subject to the broadest possible forfeiture action. Not targeted, not structured, just everything." "Then they can't disappear," Vincent said. "You can't—" She stopped herself. "Vincent, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Damian Wolf has been in my organization for 17 years, he said. "I'm thinking that I know every exit he has. Every safe house, every backup identity, every person he would call for a car or a passport or a private charter." He picked up his phone and called Frank. "I'm thinking that whatever Damien built over 17 years, he built inside my world, and my world is still standing." Frank answered. "I need everyone," Vincent said. "Not for violence. I need eyes and ears and every favor we have outstanding with every person who moves people and things in this city. Damian Wolf and Vanessa Hale are trying to leave. They cannot leave. How much time do we have?" Vincent looked at Evelyn. 48 hours at the outside," she said. "Probably less." "Less than 48 hours," Vincent said into the phone. He hung up and looked at Marcus Reeves, who was still sitting at the conference table with his hands in his lap and the expression of a man who has emptied himself completely and doesn't yet know what fills the space. "You're going to write down everything you just told us," Vincent said. "Every detail, dates, names, document descriptions, meeting locations. You're going to write it down and sign it, and Carlo is going to sit in this room with you until it's done." He paused. "And then you're going to call Alan Greer's office and tell him you need an emergency meeting, and you're going to bring him what you just gave us. Vincent, that implicates me in—" "You're already implicated," Vincent said. The question is whether you're implicated as a reluctant participant who came forward voluntarily with comprehensive documentation, or as the last man standing after Damien and Vanessa have already made their deals and named you as the architect. He held Marcus's gaze. You have about 3 hours to decide which version of that story you want to be. He left Marcus with Carlo and walked out into the main floor of the Fulton Street office with Evelyn beside him, and for a moment they both stood in the particular stillness of people who have been moving at high speed and have arrived at a brief pause before the next necessary thing. The floor around them was operating at reduced capacity, accounts frozen, executives locked out of systems, the normal machinery of a functioning organization running on manual override and anxiety. People moved carefully, spoke quietly, kept their eyes slightly averted from Vincent in the way that employees maintain when they know their world is in crisis and are waiting to find out whether it survives. The council, Evelyn said quietly. Vincent looked at her. The families, she said. Whatever Damien told Greer this morning, whether he got his deal or not, the other families will know about it by tonight, probably sooner, and when they know that your consigliere walked into Federal Plaza, they will start making decisions about their own exposure. I know. If they pull their business partnerships before the forfeiture case is resolved, the legitimate holdings lose the operating revenue that keeps them viable through the freeze period. The businesses can't survive the freeze without that cash flow. She paused. You need to call the council. And tell them what? Tell them the truth, she said, or enough of it. Tell them Damien betrayed the family. Tell them you have documentation. Tell them the federal case is targeting Damien and Vanessa specifically, and not the council's operations. And tell them... She stopped. Tell them what? She looked at him steadily. Tell them that the legitimate financial infrastructure of your holdings is under the management of Cross Meridian Capital, and that Cross Meridian has a proffer agreement with the Southern District that protects those assets from forfeiture. A pause. Tell them their money is safer with me managing it than it ever was with Damien. The sentence landed in the space between them with the particular weight of a thing that is simultaneously a business proposal and something else entirely. An acknowledgement, an extension, a door held open by the person who had every reason to let it close. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. They'll want to meet you, he said. I know. They won't expect... I know what they'll expect, she said. Let me worry about that. His phone rang again. Ray. He's in Midtown, Ray said. The Beaumont Hotel on 57th. He went in through the parking structure. Vincent, Vanessa's car is already in the garage. They're together. Vincent's jaw tightened. Floor. Working on it. Give me 10 minutes. He hung up. The next 4 hours moved with the particular compressed velocity of crisis time. Not fast exactly, but dense, each minute containing more information and decision and consequence than minutes normally hold. Frank deployed 12 people across the Beaumont's exits. Ray worked the hotel's staff connections and had a floor number in 8 minutes, 31. A suite registered under a name that traced back to one of Damien's backup identities, which meant he'd been planning this specific exit long enough to pre-book the room. Vincent and Evelyn rode uptown in the back of the car, and she was on her phone to her own legal team, and he was on his phone to Frank, and the city moved past the windows in the indifferent way cities move when they don't know or care that something decisive is being arranged inside a moving vehicle on their streets. At 57th Street, Vincent got out. Evelyn got out with him. He looked at her. You don't have to come in, he said. I know, she said, and walked toward the hotel entrance. The lobby of the Beaumont was the quiet luxury of a place where the staff had been trained to see nothing, and they moved through it quickly, Vincent and Evelyn and Frank Sorrento, who had materialized at the entrance with 2 of his people, to the elevator bank and up to 31 without interference. The corridor on 31 was carpeted and silent, the kind of institutional quiet that belongs to hotel hallways at all hours. Frank's 2 men were at the far end, near the stairwell. The suite was 3108, middle of the corridor. Vincent stopped outside the door. He looked at Frank. Frank shook his head slightly. No sounds from inside, no indication of movement. Vincent knocked. Silence. He knocked again, 3 times, the particular rhythm, 2 short, 1 long, that had been the family's internal signal for 30 years, The knock that meant open this door because the person on the other side is one of yours. A long pause. Then the sound of movement inside. The door opened. Damien Wolfe stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his jacket gone, his collar open, his face carrying the expression of a man who has spent the last 2 hours running calculations and has arrived at the conclusion that none of them resolve cleanly. He looked at Vincent. He looked at Frank. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Evelyn the longest. "You made a deal," he said. Not an accusation, more like a man confirming a variable he had suspected but not been certain of. 4 months ago, she said. Something moved through his face. Then Greer already had everything when I walked in. He had the architecture, she said. He didn't have your name as clearly as he needed it. He does now. Damien absorbed that. Behind him, from somewhere deeper in the suite, a voice, Vanessa's, tight and controlled. Damien, who is it? He didn't answer her. He looked at Vincent. I need to know something, Vincent said, before anything else, before Frank, before lawyers, before any of what comes next. His voice was quiet, completely level. The voice he used when what he was saying was the only thing in the room. The control instruments Evelyn built into the corporate structures, the trustee authority, the freeze mechanism. You built those documents. You put those clauses in. He paused. 16 years ago. Whose idea was it? Damien's jaw worked. Was it hers? Vincent said. Or was it yours? The corridor was absolutely silent. Damien looked at Evelyn, and Evelyn looked back at him with an expression that Vincent could not fully read. Not surprise, not warning, something more layered than either of those things. The expression of two people who share a long history that a third person is only now beginning to understand the shape of. Tell him, Evelyn said quietly. Damien looked back at Vincent. It was mine, he said. 16 years ago I came to Evelyn and told her that the way the family's legitimate holdings were structured left her completely exposed. That if anything ever happened, but if you ever decided she was done, she would walk away with nothing. All the work she'd done, all the businesses she'd built, all of it legally yours because of how the documents were written. He stopped. I told her I could fix it. I could build a structure that protected her work. She didn't ask me to. I came to her. Why? Vincent said. Damien's eyes were steady. Because it was the right thing to do, he said. She had built half of what you owned, and she had no protection, and you were never going to give her any because you never even saw it. He paused. And because 16 years ago I was still capable of doing something for the right reason without needing it to pay. The words sat in the corridor like something physical. Vincent looked at Damien for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn, and Evelyn looked back at him with the patient, unreadable expression of a woman who has been carrying the full weight of a very complicated truth for a very long time, and is watching the man who should have known it arrive at it 16 years late, in a hotel corridor on the 31st floor, with Frank Sorrento at his back, and the city 41 floors below, and a federal grand jury 3 weeks from filing an indictment that was going to change everything that came next, regardless of what any of them decided in the next 60 seconds. From inside the suite, Vanessa's voice again, sharper this time, the controlled quality fraying at the edges. Damien, what's happening? Nobody answered her. Vincent looked at Damien. Step aside. Damien stepped aside. They went in. The suite was large and impersonal in the way of expensive hotel rooms that have hosted 1,000 different versions of crisis. The furniture arranged for comfort that nobody was feeling, the curtains half drawn against the afternoon light, 2 open bags on the luggage rack near the window that told the story of people who had packed fast and with the specific selection criteria of people who were not planning to come back. Vanessa was standing near the window. She was dressed to travel, dark coat, hair pulled back, the red dress from last night a different life entirely. She looked at Vincent the way people look at things they have been dreading the arrival of, with a steadiness that costs something, that is manufactured rather than felt. Vincent, she said. Sit down, he said. She didn't move immediately. Her eyes went to Evelyn, and in that look, in the 2 seconds it lasted, was the full compressed history of what Vanessa had understood about Evelyn and what she had underestimated, and the specific quality of recalculation that happens when a person realizes the opponent they dismissed as irrelevant has been, the entire time, the most dangerous person in the room. She sat down. Evelyn set the portfolio on the coffee table and opened it and placed 3 documents in a row in front of Vanessa without speaking. The offshore transfer records, the beneficial ownership filing, the printed communication logs between Vanessa and the federal prosecutor's office. Vanessa looked at them. She looked at them the way you look at a hand of cards that has beaten yours. Not with surprise, because somewhere in the last hour she had probably already known this was coming, but with the particular stillness of a person absorbing a defeat that is total. The proffer agreement is already filed, Evelyn said. The prosecution has the full financial architecture of the forfeiture scheme. They have Damien's role and your role and Marcus Reeves's role documented and time-stamped 4 months ago. She paused. There is no version of the next 48 hours in which you leave this country. There is no version in which the offshore accounts are accessible. The exits you think you have, she stopped. You built your plan inside a structure I built first. You were never going to get out through it. Vanessa's jaw was tight. Her hands were in her lap and very still. What do you want? She said. Voluntary surrender, Vincent said. Today. You call Greer's office and you go in voluntarily and you give them everything. Not Damien's version, not your version, everything. He looked at her steadily. Because if you don't, what Evelyn gives them tomorrow is a case that doesn't need your cooperation at all. And the only thing voluntary surrender buys you, the only thing, is the difference between the deal you negotiate and the one they don't offer. The room was quiet. Vanessa looked at Damien. Damien looked at the floor. She looked back at Vincent, then at Evelyn, at the woman she had tried to erase from the equation and who was standing in this room holding every card in the deck with the same unhurried composure she had carried out of the Harrington Grand the night before. Fine, Vanessa said. The word came out flat and stripped of everything except its meaning. Vincent looked at Frank, who was in the doorway. Frank nodded and stepped back into the corridor to make the call. Vincent turned toward the door. Evelyn picked up the portfolio and followed. In the corridor, Vincent stopped walking. He stood with his back to the suite door and looked at the carpet and breathed. A real breath. The first one since 5:47 that morning that didn't have a specific function. That was just air moving through a body that had been running on something harder than oxygen for the past 12 hours. Evelyn stopped beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The council meeting, he said finally. Tonight. Tonight, she agreed. They're going to have questions I can't answer. Then bring me, she said. He looked at her. In the corridor light, with the afternoon bleeding thin through the window at the far end, she looked exactly like herself. Not the self he had constructed over 20 years of not paying attention, but the actual self, the one that had been there the whole time, doing the work that kept everything standing while he stood at the front of rooms accepting credit for it. Evelyn, he said. She waited. He opened his mouth and closed it and tried again, and the word that finally came out was inadequate in every way a word can be inadequate, and he said it anyway because it was the only place to start. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. She walked toward the elevator, the portfolio under her arm, her posture unchanged, her stride the same unhurried, purposeful pace it had been every day for 20 years in every room he had never truly seen her in. And Vincent Moretti stood in the corridor of the Beaumont Hotel on the 31st floor and watched her go and understood, with the complete and devastating clarity that only arrives after everything else has been stripped away, that the hardest thing left to do was not the council meeting or the federal case or the reconstruction of everything that Damien and Vanessa had tried to burn. The hardest thing left to do was earn the right to stand in the same room as her again without it being a transaction. And he did not know yet whether that was possible. But the elevator doors opened and she stepped in and turned and looked at him once across the corridor with an expression that was not warm and not cold and not forgiving, but was something more precise than any of those things. The expression of a woman who has decided, for reasons she has not yet fully disclosed, to leave a door open rather than close it. And then the door shut. And the corridor was empty. And somewhere below them, in the lobby of the Beaumont Hotel, Frank Sorrento was on the phone with Alan Greer's office, arranging a voluntary surrender, and the clock on the federal grand jury was still running, and the city outside the window was doing what cities do, which is continuing without pause or acknowledgement, indifferent to the specific human wreckage and reconstruction happening 31 floors above its streets. Vincent straightened his jacket. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. Tonight there was a council to face, and for the first time in 20 years, he was not walking into a room as the most powerful person in it. He was walking in beside her. The council met at 9 o'clock that evening in a private dining room on the top floor of a restaurant in Carroll Gardens that had been operating under the same family ownership for 31 years, and that the 5 families used for exactly this kind of gathering, because its owner was a man who understood that the price of his restaurant's continued operation was a specific and absolute quality of discretion. There were 9 men at the table when Vincent arrived. 4 dons, 2 of them in their 70s and 2 in their late 50s, each accompanied by a single advisor, and at the far end of the table, separate from the others, in the particular physical positioning of a man who has come to report rather than to deliberate, sat Alan Greer's intermediary, a senior investigator from the Southern District named Howell, who had been attending these kinds of meetings for 15 years in his capacity as the federal government's liaison to the kind of conversations that were too important to happen only in courtrooms. Vincent had not expected Howell. He stopped in the doorway for half a second, just half a second, not long enough for most of the men at the table to register it as hesitation, and then continued into the room. Evelyn was beside him. The reaction to her presence moved around the table in a wave, subtle and sequential, each man's face processing the same information in slightly different ways. Don Caruso, the eldest, who was 78 and had known Vincent for 30 years, looked at Evelyn with the careful, assessing attention of a man who had survived in a world that killed careless men by developing an extremely accurate first impression calibration. Don Ferraro, who controlled the port operations and whose opinion carried the most financial weight of anyone in the room, looked at her the way he looked at balance sheets, analytically, without effect, searching for the operative number. The others ranged between those 2 registers. None of them had expected her either. Vincent pulled out the chair at the head of the table and did not sit in it. He set his hand on the back of it and looked at Evelyn, and she sat down, and he took the chair to her right, which was the second chair, which was not where Vincent Moretti had ever sat in any room in his life. The message was not subtle. He had not intended it to be. Don Caruso looked at this arrangement for a moment and then looked at Vincent with an expression that was mostly unreadable but contained, in its deepest register, something that might have been respect. Or its precursor, at least. The recognition that a man who can make that kind of gesture without flinching has done a specific kind of internal work that very few men in their world ever do. "Thank you for coming," Vincent said. "All of you. I'll be brief about the facts, and then Evelyn will speak to the financial situation, and then I imagine Howell has something to add." Howell, at the far end, nodded once. Vincent told them about Damien. He told them cleanly and without embellishment, the way you describe a structural failure set, not with emotion, not with the performance of betrayal, but with the specific factual account of what had been built and what had been compromised, and what the current exposure looked like. He told them about Vanessa and the federal cooperation and the asset forfeiture scheme. He told them about Marcus Reeves. He told them about the voluntary surrenders, which had been processed by Greer's office between 4 and 6 that evening. Vanessa first, Marcus 2 hours later, both of them arriving with lawyers and cooperation agreements already drafted. He did not tell them about the 11 months. He did not tell them about the proffer agreement's origins or the recordings or the full private architecture of what Evelyn had built and when and why. Those were details that belonged to a different conversation, a smaller one, and he had learned enough in the past 16 hours to understand the difference between what a room needs to know to make a decision and what a room needs to know about the full truth of a thing. When he finished, Don Ferraro said, "Damien, in federal custody as of 7 this evening," Vincent said. "He went in voluntarily. His cooperation agreement is separate from Vanessa's." "They'll testify against each other," Don Caruso said. "Yes, and against you." "Their cooperation is scoped to the forfeiture scheme and the financial structures," Vincent said. The terms of their agreements, as we understand them, do not extend to the family's operational activities. Howell can confirm the scope. Every head at the table turned to Howell. Howell was a careful man who had the specific quality of federal officials who have spent decades in rooms where what they say will be weighed very precisely. He said, "The cooperation agreements executed today are scoped to the financial fraud and asset forfeiture conspiracy. The Southern District's interest is in the individuals who constructed and operated the scheme. The investigation does not, at this time, extend to the organizational activities of the families represented in this room." At this time. Two of the men at the table heard those words and their expressions didn't change, because they were men whose expressions had been trained over decades not to change, but their eyes moved very slightly, and Vincent caught it and understood that the qualifier had landed exactly where it was designed to land. "The legitimate holdings," Don Ferraro said. "The frozen accounts. The businesses." Evelyn spoke for the first time. She did not introduce herself. She did not preface her remarks with any of the social mechanisms that people use to establish credibility in rooms where they are unknown. She simply began speaking in the same level, precise voice she had used in her office on the 42nd floor, and the quality of what she said, the specificity of it, the technical accuracy, the command of detail, established her credibility more effectively than any introduction could have. She described the proffer agreement. She described the immunity protections covering every entity under Cross Meridian's controlling authority. She described the timeline for the administrative unfreezing of the affected accounts, which her legal team had been negotiating with the relevant financial institutions since that afternoon and which was expected to begin within 72 hours and be substantially complete within 2 weeks. She described the restructuring she was proposing for the legitimate holdings, a consolidation under Cross Meridian's management architecture that would provide cleaner legal separation between the family's legitimate investments and any activities that carried federal exposure. She described it the way an architect describes a building, not selling it, not persuading, just showing the structure and letting the structure speak for itself. When she finished, Don Caruso looked at her for a long moment. "You built the control instruments into the corporate structures," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a man confirming his understanding of what had happened." "Yes," she said. 16 years ago. "The earliest ones, yes." "While you were married to Vincent." "While I was married to Vincent and managing the legitimate financial architecture of his holdings, which at that time were significantly less sophisticated than what they became over the following decade." She held his gaze. "I built those protections because the work I was doing had no legal protection without them. The fact that they also served as a defense against the forfeiture scheme was not something I anticipated 16 years ago. It was a consequence of the structure I built for other reasons." "And the forfeiture scheme," Don Ferraro said. "You anticipated that." "I became aware of it 11 months ago and spent those 11 months building a response. Without telling Vincent." A pause. One beat. "Yes." Don Ferraro looked at Vincent. "She made a better decision than I would have made," Vincent said. "If she'd come to me 11 months ago with what she knew, I would have confronted Damien directly and destroyed the evidentiary record she was building. The proffer agreement would not exist. The immunity protections would not exist. And this conversation would be happening under significantly worse circumstances." The room absorbed that. Don Caruso looked at his hands on the table for a moment. He was a man who had outlived 3 rivals, 2 federal investigations, and 1 attempt on his life. And the quality of his stillness suggested someone who had developed over many decades a very accurate sense of which direction the future was actually moving, regardless of which direction people were pointing. "The Northbridge proposal," he said. He was looking at Evelyn. "The consolidation you're describing, what does that look like for our existing arrangements?" And for the next 40 minutes, Evelyn answered questions. She answered them from Don Ferraro and Don Caruso, and the 2 younger Dons, and from the advisors and from Howell, who asked 2 specific legal questions that she answered with the kind of precision that told everyone in the room she had anticipated both questions and had prepared answers that had been reviewed by lawyers before she walked in. She answered them without notes, without hesitation on any of the substantive points, and with the particular authority of someone who is not performing expertise but simply has it. Vincent sat to her right and said almost nothing. He said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was watching something happen, watching the room recalibrate, watching 9 men who had spent their entire adult lives in a world where women were peripheral. Reclassify the person at the head of the table in real time, reluctantly and then less reluctantly, and then, in the case of Don Caruso, with something approaching genuine interest, and the watching required the kind of concentrated attention that precluded speaking. At 10:47, Don Ferraro said, "I'll want my financial team to review the consolidation structure before I commit." "Of course," Evelyn said. "I'll have documentation to your office by tomorrow morning. And the 2-week timeline for the account unfreezing. You're confident." "My team has been on the phone with 3 of the 4 affected institutions since this afternoon. The legal instruments supporting the unfreeze are clean and uncontested. 2 weeks is conservative." Ferraro nodded. One small, precise nod that meant something specific in his world. Not agreement, not approval, but the particular acknowledgement of a man who has received information he considers reliable. Don Caruso looked at Vincent. "You should have introduced us sooner," he said. It was said without irony and without warmth, as a simple statement of fact from a man who did not traffic in either. Vincent held his gaze and said, "Yes, I should have." The meeting ended at 11:15. The men filed out with the unhurried efficiency of people who have been concluding serious meetings for decades and know how to exit a room without leaving anything unresolved in it. Howell was last, and he stopped beside Evelyn on his way to the door and handed her a business card and said, quietly enough that Vincent almost didn't catch it, "When the restructuring documents are ready, call me before you file anything. There are people in my office who will want to be helpful." He paused. The way this was handled today, the voluntary surrenders, the proffer, the documentation, it made our job significantly easier. That doesn't go unnoticed. He left. The room was empty except for Vincent and Evelyn. The restaurant staff had been kept out for the duration of the meeting and had left water and coffee on the sideboard that nobody had touched. The candles on the table had burned down by about a third. The chairs were slightly displaced from where they'd started, each one a minor record of who had leaned forward and who had pulled back and at what moments during the last 2 hours. Evelyn stood and picked up her portfolio and her coat. Vincent said, "Caruso is going to sign on." "I know," she said. "Ferraro will take 4 days. The other 2 will follow Ferraro." "That's the whole council." "That's the whole council." He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and put it on and buttoned it and looked at her across the table in the candlelight of a room that smelled like old wood and long conversations. "Where do you go from here?" he said. "Home," she said. "I have a 7 o'clock call with Tokyo." He stopped. She looked at him and waited. "I mean from here," he said. "From all of this. The restructuring, the consolidation, the council relationships. What does it look like in a year?" She considered the question for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but in the particular way of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. "Northbridge Financial Alliance," she said. "The name I've been using internally for the restructured entity. It provides legitimate financial management services to family-owned enterprises. Clean revenue, legal operations, full regulatory compliance." She paused. "In a year it looks like what Cross Meridian looks like now, but larger, with relationships that Cross Meridian doesn't currently have. The council relationships. Among others." He nodded slowly. "And me," he said, "in that picture. What do I look like?" She was quiet for a moment. The candles moved slightly. A draft from somewhere, the building breathing. And the light on her face shifted and steadied. "That depends on you," she said. "Not on me. Not on the council or the federal case or what comes out of the next 6 months of legal proceedings." She held his gaze with the same directness she had held it all day, through all of it, without softening and without cruelty. "You spent 20 years building a world where you were the only person who mattered in it. And then you were surprised when the people you'd made invisible turned out to have been doing the work the whole time. I know that. Knowing it and living differently are separate things," she said. "I've watched you know things your entire adult life without it changing anything about how you operated." The words landed without softening, and he took them the way he'd been taking hard information all day. Straight, without flinching, because flinching was a luxury that the day had cost him. "I'm not asking to come back," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here asking you to. I understand what I did. I understand what it cost." He paused. "I'm asking what's possible, not personally, professionally. Whether the work we did today is a one-time thing, or whether it's the beginning of something I can earn a place in." She looked at him for a long time. "The Northbridge board will have 5 seats," she said finally. "I'll hold 3 of them and appoint 2 independent directors. The council will have advisory representation, but not board seats." She paused. "There will be a 6th seat, a non-voting observer position. For someone with your operational knowledge of the family network, the relationships, the history, the informal architecture of how things actually work in this world, that knowledge is useful. If the person holding it understands they are there in an advisory capacity and not a directive one." Vincent looked at her. "Non-voting," he said. "Non-voting," she confirmed. "The decisions are mine, the structure is mine, the legal authority is mine. What you bring is knowledge and relationships that have value, and what you receive in exchange is a seat in the room." She held his gaze. "Not the head of the table, a seat. That's what's available." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll take it," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Something smaller and more complicated than a smile. The expression of a person who has heard an answer they considered possible but were not certain of and are now recalibrating accordingly. "Don't thank me," she said. "Earn it." She walked to the door. He didn't follow immediately. He stood at the table and looked at the room. The displaced chairs, the burned-down candles, the untouched coffee on the sideboard, and breathed and let the enormity of the day settle through him, the way sediment settles through disturbed water, slowly and without drama, each particle finding its level. 24 hours ago, he had stood in this city, convinced he was its most powerful man. He had been wrong about that in every way a man can be wrong about something. Wrong about the nature of power, wrong about who held it, wrong about what it was built from and how it was sustained and what it cost to maintain over decades of invisible work that he had claimed credit for without understanding what the credit was for. The empire he thought he'd built had been held up, from the inside, by a woman he'd described as a housewife in front of 300 people and called invisible. She was, as it turned out, the only load-bearing wall. He put on his jacket and walked out. The months that followed moved with the particular pace of legal proceedings and institutional restructuring. Not fast, not dramatic, but inexorable in the way that things are inexorable when the paperwork is correctly filed and the authorities have what they need, and the machinery of consequence simply runs. Damian Wolfe pleaded guilty in federal court 11 weeks after the council meeting to a consolidated charge of financial fraud and conspiracy in connection with the asset forfeiture scheme. His cooperation agreement reduced his sentence to 7 years. He would be eligible for parole in 4. He made no public statement. He had nothing left to say that anyone needed to hear. Vanessa Hale's case moved more slowly because her attorneys were better and her assets, what remained of them after the offshore accounts were traced and frozen by the federal government, could pay for better attorneys for longer. She ultimately entered a plea agreement 4 months after her voluntary surrender. The terms were less favorable than Damian's because she had less to offer and had offered it later. She received 9 years. The finder's arrangement she had negotiated with the prosecution was voided under the terms of her plea. The money she had spent 2 years building a plan to acquire remained permanently beyond her reach. Marcus Reeves was disbarred. His cooperation with the prosecution, while comprehensive, came late enough and under enough duress that the United States Attorney's Office declined to offer him immunity. He was charged with obstruction and breach of attorney-client privilege and pled no contest to a reduced charge. He lost his license, his practice, and the consulting entity he had incorporated 9 days before the morning that ended his career. He moved to Florida, which is where certain kinds of men go when their particular version of things has run its course in New York. The accounts began unfreezing on the 3rd day after the council meeting, exactly as Evelyn had projected, and were substantially restored within 12 days. The 2-week estimate had been conservative. The Northbridge Financial Alliance was formally incorporated 4 months after the Beaumont Hotel. Its 5 board seats were filled as Evelyn had described, 3 held by her, two by independent directors with backgrounds in institutional finance and regulatory compliance. Its first clients were three of the four council families, with the fourth signing on 6 weeks after the others, which was 2 days faster than Evelyn had projected and 3 days faster than Ferraro's initial posture had suggested he would move. The executives who had locked themselves out of Moretti-adjacent systems on the morning after the anniversary party began requesting meetings with Cross Meridian's relationship management team within the first month. By the end of the second month, the queue for those meetings was 3 weeks long. The same men who had photographed Evelyn's exit from the Harrington Grand ran stories in their outlets about the emergence of Northbridge Financial Alliance as one of the more significant new institutional players in the New York market. None of the stories mentioned the anniversary party. None of them mentioned Vincent. The stories were about Evelyn Cross, who had built something extraordinary and was now running it in the full light of the day, which was the only thing that had changed. Not the thing itself, which had been there all along, but the light it was in. Vincent fulfilled his role as non-voting observer with the particular quality of a man doing penance that he has chosen rather than been assigned. He showed up. He knew the room. He knew the relationships and their histories and the informal weights and obligations that don't appear in any document, but that are as binding as any contract in the world he came from. He used that knowledge in service of Evelyn's decisions and did not attempt to redirect those decisions toward his own preferences, which was harder than it sounded for a man who had spent 30 years operating as the center of gravity in every room he entered. He was not always good at it. He made 3 significant errors of judgment in the first 6 months, 2 of them in meetings where his instinct to dominate the conversation overrode his understanding of his role, and 1 of them in a private communication with Don Caruso. That presumed an authority he no longer held. Each time, Evelyn addressed it directly and without ceremony. A closed-door conversation, a specific accounting of what had happened and why it was a problem, a clear statement of what was expected going forward. No theater, no accumulated resentment, just the clear, functional consequence of someone who manages with precision rather than emotion. He received these corrections with less grace than he would have liked and more grace than he would have expected of himself, which he understood was a form of progress, even if it didn't feel like one. On a Tuesday morning in March, 8 months after the council meeting, Evelyn arrived at the Cross Meridian offices to find a handwritten note on her desk. No envelope, no signature she recognized initially, just a folded piece of heavy paper with her name on the outside in handwriting that took her a moment to place because she had not seen it in a context like this in 20 years. Inside, I read everything I signed, all of it. It took me 3 weeks. I wanted you to know. She held the note for a moment, then she set it on her desk and picked up her coffee and opened her laptop and went to work, because there were calls to make and documents to review and decisions that required her attention, and the day was already moving at the pace days move when you are running something real. She did not throw the note away. That evening, Vincent sat in his apartment on the Upper East Side, smaller than the one he'd had during the marriage, appropriate to a man whose life had been substantially recalibrated, and poured 2 fingers of bourbon and did not drink it immediately. He sat with it in his hand and looked out the window at the city that had been the context of his entire adult life, its lights coming up in the early dark of a March evening, the particular density of it, the specific weight of a place that contains that many lives moving simultaneously in that much proximity. He thought about what he had built. He thought about what he had failed to see. He thought about Damian Wolfe, who had spent 17 years as the most trusted man in Vincent's world, and had built his betrayal so carefully inside that trust that it had been nearly invisible until it wasn't. He thought about what that said about trust, and what it cost, and whether the cost was worth paying again, which was a question he kept returning to without arriving at an answer that satisfied him, which he had come to understand was perhaps the point, that some questions are not meant to resolve but to remain present, to do their work on you over time the way water does its work on stone, slowly and without drama. He thought about Vanessa, which he did less often now than in the first weeks after the Beaumont Hotel, when the specific shape of that particular manipulation had been fresh enough to produce a physical reaction, a tightening in the chest, a retroactive nausea at the clarity of how completely he had been played. Now when he thought about her, it was with a more complicated emotion, something that had elements of anger still, but also something he could only call instruction. She had used his arrogance against him with a precision that required she understand his arrogance completely, which meant she had seen him clearly, which meant the portrait she'd worked from was accurate. A man could learn from that if he was willing to look at it honestly. Vincent was working on being willing. He thought about Evelyn. He thought about her the way you think about something that has been present your entire life, and that you have finally, very late, begun to see correctly. Not with the distortion of what you needed it to be, not through the simplifying lens of the story you told yourself about what it was, but as itself. Complex and self-determined and in possession of depths that he had not had the attention span or the humility to sound. She had built something extraordinary in the space his inattention created. She had protected it with a patience and a legal ingenuity that still, 8 months later, he found himself returning to with something that was not quite awe, but was in that neighborhood. She had spent 11 months watching a trap close around her, and had used those 11 months to complete the work that made the trap irrelevant. And when the moment came, she had not reached for cruelty or revenge. She had reached for documentation, for legal instruments, for the precise and targeted application of what she had built over 16 years. She had won by being better at the work than anyone who was trying to destroy her. That was not a lesson Vincent Moretti had been taught in the world he came from. In his world, you won by being harder, louder, more willing to visit consequences on people who crossed you. You won by fear. Evelyn had won by knowing more, building better, and being patient longer than anyone who underestimated her could sustain. He picked up the bourbon and drank it. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, which was continuing. Not triumphantly, not tragically, just continuing. The lights coming on in the buildings across the park, the traffic below moving in its patterns, the particular low machinery of a city at evening that sounds like the ambient noise of 10 million separate lives running simultaneously, each one its own complete world, invisible to the others unless someone pays enough attention to look. He had not paid enough attention for 20 years. He was paying it now. It was late, and the day had been long, and tomorrow there was a Northbridge board preparation meeting that he would attend in his non-voting capacity and contribute to in the specific ways that his knowledge made useful and defer to in the ways that his role required. And he would do that work with the deliberate care of a man who understands that the only territory worth reclaiming is the kind you earn rather than the kind you simply occupy and call yours by default. He set down the glass. He turned off the light. The city went on outside the window, indifferent and luminous, holding every story that had ever been told inside it without preference or judgment, the way cities hold things. All of it, the betrayal and the reckoning, and the slow, difficult work of becoming something other than what you started as. All of it just part of the fabric, just part of what the place is made of. And in an office on the 43rd floor of a building on Park Avenue, a woman who had built an empire from the inside of another man's story was still at her desk at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in March, reading documents and making notes in her small, precise handwriting, her coffee cold, the city laid out below her in all directions, belonging to no one and available to whoever had the patience and the intelligence and the willingness to build something real inside it. The note was still on her desk. She had not thrown it away.